Welcome to Time Before Us, the channel where ancient history breathes again. Before time had a name, before the first human breath, there existed a world fierce, forgotten, and alive. Creatures of scale and silence, predators wrapped in. Feathers, titans that shook the earth. Lives erased, bones buried beneath eternity. But they are not lost. They are waiting. This is Time Before Us, where prehistory worlds rise again, and the stories buried in stone finally speak. Chapter 1. The Feathered Truth About Velociraptor. If you've ever watched Jurassic Park, the name Velociraptor probably brings up a vivid image. A sleek, 6-foot-tall predator, razor-clawed and lightning-fast. Stalking through jungles in coordinated packs, they open doors. They outsmart humans. They pounce with surgical precision, slicing their prey apart with that infamous sickle-shaped toe claw. It's a perfect horror movie monster, but that Hollywood nightmare? It's almost entirely fiction. The real Velociraptor mongoliensis, one that lived over 75 million years ago in what is now Mongolia, was about the size of a turkey. Let that sink in. Not a wolf, not a man-sized beast. A turkey. It measured about 6 to 7 feet long from nose to tail, but most of that was tail. In terms of height, maybe up to your knee. And it weighed about 30 pounds, less than most family dogs. And the biggest surprise? It had feathers. Lots of them. Forget the lizard-like skin of the movie version. The real Velociraptor was more bird than beast. It had feathers along its arms and tail, possibly even a crest or tufted plumage on its head. Imagine a predator that looked more like a fierce, ground-running hawk than a miniature T-Rex. Its arms, with long grasping fingers, weren't useless. They were likely used to stabilize while running or grappling prey. Its stiff tail helped it balance, much like a cheetah's tail aids in sharp turns. And those feathers? Not for flight, but for insulation, display, and agility. Now, how do we know it had feathers? In 2007, paleontologists discovered quill knobs, small bumps, along the forearm bones where large feathers anchor to the skeleton. Birds have them today, so did Velociraptor. That's not a guess. That's physical, fossilized proof. In other words, the debate about whether Velociraptor had feathers is over. It did. The evidence is quite literally in the bone dot, so where did the image of the scaly superraptor come from? Well, when Jurassic Park was being developed in the early 90s, the feathered dinosaur revolution hadn't hit yet. Scientists were only beginning to piece together the link between birds and dinosaurs. And Hollywood had a different priority: drama. Director Steven Spielberg and his team needed a terrifying, intelligent villain, and they found it, not in Velociraptor, but in another dinosaur entirely, Deinonychus. Deinonychus was a relative of Velociraptor, part of the Dromaeosaurid family, but it was larger, stronger, and much more intimidating. Standing nearly 6 feet tall and stretching over 10 feet in length, Deinonychus anteropus was closer to what you saw in the film. The name Velociraptor just sounded cooler, so they used it. They essentially swapped names, but kept the bulkier frame of Deinonychus. Even so, recent studies suggest that even Deinonychus likely had feathers. So the Jurassic Park version? Still not accurate. No matter which species you choose, those leathery-skinned, lizard-looking raptors were a dramatic fabrication. Let's talk about that claw, the famous curved talon on the second toe, lifted off the ground as they walked. Hollywood told us it was a slashing weapon, capable of gutting prey in a single swipe. But paleontologists now think it was more like a grappling hook. Instead of slicing, raptors may have used the claw to latch onto struggling prey, pinning it down while they bit or tore at it with their teeth. Sound familiar? That's almost exactly how modern birds of prey like eagles and hawks kill, not with their beaks, but with their feet. In fact, some researchers believe dromaeosaurs may have hunted similarly, leaping onto small dinosaurs or lizards and holding them down with their clawed feet while delivering fatal bites. It's not quite the same as a raptor slashing open your belly in a kitchen, but it's still terrifying, just in a different way. Now, what about that famous scene, the raptors hunting in packs? That idea comes partly from fossil finds, where multiple dromaeosaurs were found around a single prey animal, like the famous fighting dinosaurs fossil, which shows a velociraptor locked in combat with a Triceratops. But was it coordinated? Hunting like wolves, or just a feeding frenzy? That's still debated. Some paleontologists argue raptors may have been more solitary, opportunistic predators, drawn to the same carcass. Others believe certain species might have shown primitive pack behavior, but intelligent, military-style tactics? That's pure cinema. Speaking of intelligence, were velociraptors smart? Compared to many dinosaurs, yes. Their brain size relative to body mass, called the encephalization quotient, was fairly high for a non-avian dinosaur. They likely had good problem-solving skills, acute senses, and fast reflexes, but not door-opening intelligence. That's another example of Hollywood dialing things up to 11. Still, we shouldn't downplay their abilities. Velociraptors had excellent binocular vision, a sharp sense of smell, and were built for speed and agility. They were fast runners, likely capable of sudden bursts when chasing prey. And their bird-like hips and hollow bones made them light, agile, and highly maneuverable. But again, that word, bird-like dot, because here's the bigger picture most people still don't realize. Velociraptor wasn't some strange cousin of birds. It was on the same evolutionary tree. Birds are dinosaurs. Not descendants in the distant sense, like mammals from reptiles, but a direct line. Velociraptor and a pigeon share more genetic history than Velociraptor and a crocodile. If Velociraptor hadn't gone extinct, but had shrunk a bit and grown wings, you might just see it in your backyard, pecking at birdseed. So, why does this matter? Because it forces us to rethink how we imagine the past. It reminds us that what we know is often shaped by pop culture more than science. And when science catches up, when new fossils, new technology, and new ideas rewrite the script, we have to let go of the myths, no matter how cinematic they are. Velociraptor wasn't a monster. It was a real animal. A strange, feathered predator that once roamed ancient deserts, chasing down prey with speed, cunning, and precision. It didn't roar, it didn't open doors, but it did survive in one of the harshest prehistoric ecosystems for millions of years. And, honestly, that's way more impressive than fiction. Chapter 2T, Rex, not what you think for over a century. Tyrannosaurus Rex has ruled the public imagination. It's the undisputed king of the dinosaurs. A towering, snarling apex predator, crashing through forests, crushing cars, devouring goats, and roaring louder than a jet engine. But the truth? The real T-Rex was a very different creature from the one we've seen on screen. In fact, if you met a real Tyrannosaurus Rex up close, in all its prehistoric glory, you might be surprised by what you didn't see. And what you did. First, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Or rather, the bird, because despite its fearsome reputation, T-Rex may have looked less like a giant reptile and more like a monstrous feathered bird. For years, paleontologists debated whether adult T-Rex had feathers, and while the fossil record is still incomplete, the picture is shifting. We know that many smaller tyrannosaurs, like DeLong and Yutyrannus, both from China, had feathers. Actual fossilized feathers. And they weren't some obscure relatives. These were early members of the Tyrannosaur family, and they lived just a few million years before T-Rex. That strongly suggests feathers were an ancestral trait. So why haven't we found direct feather evidence on T-Rex itself? Well, most T-Rex fossils come from rock formations that don't preserve feathers well. It's possible they had feathers that simply didn't fossilize. Some scientists believe juvenile T-Rex had a fine covering of feathers that they lost as they grew older and larger. Think of elephants. Baby elephants have fuzz, but adults don't need it because of their size. The same may have applied to T-Rex. At nearly 40 feet long and over 9 tons in weight, insulation might have been unnecessary, but that doesn't mean it looked like a leathery lizard. Even more compelling, evidence suggests his T-Rex may have had lips. Not kissy, pouty lips, but soft tissue covering its massive teeth when its mouth was closed. You know how crocodiles have visible teeth, even when their mouths are shut? That's not what T-Rex likely looked like. CT scans and studies of jawbones show that exposed teeth would dry out, crack, and be vulnerable to damage. Most modern reptiles with large teeth, like monitor lizards, actually hide their fangs behind lips, so the always exposed teeth look from movies? Just dramatic flair. Real T-Rex may have had a closed-mouth grin most of the time. Now let's talk about its arms, those famously tiny, almost comical forelimbs. What's the point of having such puny arms on a creature so massive? Could it do anything with them? The answer might surprise you. Though small, T-Rex's arms were incredibly strong. Each could curl over 400 pounds. They had thick bones, massive muscle attachments, and 2 powerful claws. They likely weren't used to fight prey. The jaws did all the heavy lifting there, but they may have helped T-Rex grip mates during reproduction, rise from a lying position, or clutch struggling prey that was already in its mouth. So while they look ridiculous, they weren't useless. They were specialized tools, like grappling hooks or kickstands, evolved for very specific tasks. But what truly redefines T-Rex is its brain. But here, not because it was massive, it wasn't, but because it was advanced. Inside that dinosaur-sized skull was a surprisingly bird-like brain. It had excellent vision, possibly better than an eagle's. It had an incredible sense of smell. Thanks to enormous olfactory bulbs, the part of the brain that processes scent, it could likely smell prey from miles away. And its inner ear structure suggests it had great balance and possibly decent hearing range. In other words, T-Rex wasn't a lumbering brute. It was a sharp-sensed, highly tuned predator. And speaking of movement, no, it didn't run at 45 miles per hour. That's movie magic. The physics just don't add up. At over 9 tons, a running T-Rex would have shattered its legs. Recent biomechanical studies suggest it could walk or trot at about 10 to 20 miles per hour, fast enough to chase down large herbivores, but not exactly a sprinting sprinter. But here's the twist that really blows people's minds. T-Rex may have been a scavenger, at least part of the time. That idea was once controversial, even mocked. Why would the king of dinosaurs scavenge carcasses instead of hunting live prey? But think about modern apex predators. Lions scavenge when they can. So do bears. So do wolves. It's not a weakness, it's smart biology. If you're a massive predator and you smell a dead hadrosaur half a mile away, why not take the free meal and that famous bite? It wasn't just powerful, it was record-breaking. T-Rex had the strongest bite force of any terrestrial animal in Earth's history. Over 12,000 pounds per square inch. Enough to crush bone like dry twigs. Its teeth were not daggers, but bananas, thick, blunt, and serrated, perfect for sawing through flesh and pulverizing bone. Fossils show it swallowed chunks whole, bones and all. There's even evidence it ate other T-Rex. That's right, we found bones with bite marks that match T-Rex jaws. Cannibalism isn't off the table. And then there's the question of behavior. Was T-Rex a solitary hunter? A social predator? A parent? Some paleontologists speculate it may have raised young for a time. Others think juveniles were faster, feathered, and filled a different ecological niche, like hyenas to the adult's lion. There may have been age-based packs or overlapping roles. We don't know yet. But new fossil finds are shedding more light every year. And one more fun fact, T-Rex may not have roared. Sorry, Hollywood. The iconic roar used in movies is a mix of elephant, lion, and alligator sounds. In reality, T-Rex likely made deep, resonant booms or low-frequency rumbles, more like a crocodile's bellow or a distant thunderclap than a lion's roar. It didn't need volume. It needed power and presence, and a subsonic growl might have shaken the ground like a rolling earthquake. So, let's recap. The real Tyrannosaurus rex wasn't a green-skinned, scaly brute. It might have been partially feathered. It had lips, strong but small arms, powerful senses, and a bite that could crack bone. It didn't sprint. It may have scavenged. It possibly cared for young. It was less monster, more apex strategist, and honestly, that's so much cooler than the monster movie version, because the reality of T-Rex doesn't make it less scary. It makes it more real. It was a living, breathing animal. Not invincible, not evil. Just incredibly, perfectly adapted to dominate its world. The king? Still very much so. But the crown it wore was feathered, not forged in nightmare. Chapter 3, Dilophosaurus didn't spit poison it. That's one of the most memorable scenes in Jurassic Park. Dennis Nedry, the bumbling villain, crashes his Jeep in a storm and finds himself face to face with a small, wide-eyed dinosaur. It looks curious, almost harmless, until it suddenly flares out a frilled collar, shrieks like a broken kettle, and spits black venom into Nedry's face. Blinded and screaming, he slips into the mud, never to be seen again. It's terrifying. It's iconic. And it's pure fiction. The dinosaur in that scene is Dilophosaurus, a real creature that did, in fact, live during the early Jurassic period. But the version we saw on screen, the frilled neck venom spitter no taller than a golden retriever, was a Hollywood fabrication, stitched together for dramatic flair. In reality, Dilophosaurus wetherilli was a very different animal. For starters, it was massive, far larger than the film suggests. Not the size of a dog, not even a large bird. The real Dilophosaurus was about 20 feet long, stood over 6 feet tall at the hips, and weighed close to 900 pounds. That's not something that's hiding behind your Jeep in a rainstorm. That's a predator you'd spot from across the valley and hope it doesn't spot you. So how did we get it so wrong? Well, it starts with what we didn't know in the early 90s. When Jurassic Park was being made, Dilophosaurus was still something of a mystery. Fossil evidence was fragmentary. Scientists knew it had an unusual double crest on its skull, a thin, bony structure that arched backward like twin mohawks. But they weren't quite sure what to make of it. Enter movie magic. Michael Crichton, in his original novel, wanted a creature that was visually distinctive and dangerous in a new way. Steven Spielberg agreed. The movie already had its giant monsters. What they needed was a surprise, a smaller, creepier threat. So they took liberties. A lot of them. They shrank it to half its actual size. They gave it an expandable neck frill, something inspired by the real-life frill-necked lizard of Australia. It's a cool-looking feature, but there's no fossil evidence that Dilophosaurus or any other dinosaur had one. And the venom? That was pure invention too. There's no indication that Dilophosaurus could spit venom or even produce venom at all. Unlike some modern reptiles like spitting cobras or Gila monsters, no known dinosaur has skeletal features associated with venom. Glands, hollow fangs, or delivery grooves. The idea made for a shocking scene, but it's simply not grounded in science. So, what was Dilophosaurus really like? Despite the myths, it was still a fascinating and deadly predator. Living about 193 million years ago, during the early Jurassic, it was one of the first truly large carnivorous dinosaurs. Its double crest may have been used for display, perhaps to attract mates, intimidate rivals, or identify members of its species. Think of the crests on modern birds like cassowaries or the fans of a peacock. They don't need to serve a functional purpose in hunting. They serve social functions. The skull of Dilophosaurus was long, narrow, and relatively lightweight. Its jaws weren't built for bone crushing like T-Rex, but more likely for slicing flesh. Its teeth were curved and serrated, ideal for cutting through soft tissue. And like many early theropods, it had a flexible body, strong legs, and 3 sharp claws on each hand, tools of agility and control. Interestingly, its upper jaw had a noticeable notch, a gap between the premaxilla, the front part of the upper jaw, and the maxilla. This feature, sometimes exaggerated in reconstructions, may have helped it grip prey more securely or accommodate larger bites. There's even debate as to whether Dilophosaurus was primarily a scavenger, an ambush predator, or something in between. One thing is certain, it wasn't the sneaky, venomous lurker the movie made it out to be. It was bold, it was fast, and it probably hunted medium-sized prey, early sauropodomorphs, small reptiles, or even fish and carrion when the opportunity arose. But perhaps what makes Dilophosaurus truly compelling is that it represents a transitional form, a glimpse into how dinosaurs evolved into the massive predators of the later Jurassic and Cretaceous. It was part of a moment in time when theropods were experimenting with size, form, and behavior. It had a lighter frame than later giants, but also more elaborate ornamentation. It wasn't primitive, it was pioneering. And yes, if you stumbled across a living Dilophosaurus, you'd still run the other way. Imagine it, 20 feet of muscle and bone, twin crests catching the sunlight, serrated teeth gleaming, claws ready. It wouldn't be hiding behind a fern or playing coy in the rain. It would be charging, jaw wide, legs pounding the earth. No venom, no frill. Just raw, unfiltered prehistoric power. Even more fascinating is how its legacy lived on. The crests of Dilophosaurus may have inspired later species like Cryolophosaurus, a crested predator from Antarctica. And though it went extinct long before the likes of Allosaurus and T-Rex, it helped pave the evolutionary path for the heavyweights of the Jurassic world. But there's a deeper lesson here. The fact that so many people associate Dilophosaurus with fake features, venom, frills, dog-sized stature, tells us just how powerful fiction can be in shaping what we think we know. A single movie scene, however memorable, can overwrite actual science in the public imagination for decades. Even now, many dinosaur toys and books still show Dilophosaurus as a tiny frill-spitter. It's a reminder that dinosaurs, like all ancient creatures, deserve to be understood as they were, not as props for our storytelling. Because when you strip away the myths, what you're left with is still awe-inspiring. A predator unlike anything walking the earth today. A relic of a time when the rules of life were still being written. Not a monster, but a marvel. So, next time you hear someone talk about the dinosaur that spits venom, you can smile and tell them the real story. Because the truth, as always, is wilder than the movie version. Chapter 4. Pterosaurs aren't dinosaurs. I've seen them soaring above volcanoes, gliding through prehistoric skies, diving over coastlines in flocks. They're the winged giants of every dinosaur documentary and movie ever made. And if you've ever lumped them in with the rest of the dinosaurs, you're definitely not alone. That's the truth that changes everything. Pterosaurs weren't dinosaurs. That's right. All your life, you've probably been told, or assumed, that these flying reptiles were just the aerial branch of the dinosaur family tree. But scientifically, that's incorrect. Pterosaurs were their own group. Closely related to dinosaurs, yes. They both fall under a larger group called archosaurs, but they split off down a different evolutionary path long before the first T-Rex ever took a breath. So what exactly were pterosaurs? They were the first vertebrates to evolve powered flight. Not just gliding, actual flight with flapping wings, lift, and sustained aerial movement. And they did it long before birds took to the skies. In fact, they ruled the air for over 150 million years. But don't picture them all as massive, leathery beasts. Pterosaurs came in an astonishing range of sizes, shapes, and lifestyles. Some were no bigger than a sparrow. Others, like Quetzalcoatlus northropi, had wingspans reaching 35 feet or more. That's roughly the size of an F-16 fighter jet. And yet, they could likely launch themselves from the ground and fly, not because they were light, but because they were marvels of biomechanical design. One of the biggest myths about pterosaurs, aside from them being dinosaurs, is how they looked. Movies often portray them like overgrown bats, leathery wings, reptilian faces, shrieking vocals, and aggressive, predatory behavior. And while the wings part is true, they did have membranous wings. The rest is a patchwork of outdated guesswork and pop culture invention. In reality, many pterosaurs were covered in fuzz. That's right, fuzzy, hair-like filaments called pycnofibers. For decades, scientists thought they were scaly, but closer fossil analysis revealed textures that looked more like fur. These filaments likely helped them regulate body temperature, just as feathers or fur do today. Some species might even have had colorful crests, elaborate headgear made of bone and soft tissue. These weren't just decorations, they were visual signals. Just like toucans or peacocks today, pterosaurs probably used their crests for attracting mates, scaring rivals, or identifying each other. One species, Tupandactylus, had a head crest taller than its own body. Imagine that, flying around with a built-in sail on your skull. And let's talk about their wings, because they're nothing short of evolutionary genius. Pterosaur wings were made from a skin membrane that stretched from the ankle to the tip of an elongated fourth finger. That finger could be longer than the rest of the arm combined. It supported the wing like a sailboat mast holds a sail. But the wing wasn't just a flat sheet. It had muscle, blood vessels, and a sophisticated system of fibers that gave it strength, flexibility, and control. They weren't just flapping aimlessly. Pterosaurs could maneuver, glide, dive, and soar with extraordinary grace. In fact, some species were built for long-distance travel, catching thermal air currents and riding them for hours, even days, across ancient oceans. Others may have been more agile, flitting through forests and snapping up insects mid-flight. And their diversity didn't stop with their size or wings. Some had long, toothy snouts, perfect for fishing, like Pteranodon or Ramphorhynchus. Others had beaks, or even filter-feeding adaptations like flamingos. One species, Zungaripterus, had crushing teeth, suggesting it hunted shellfish. Pterosaurs weren't just one thing. They were an entire class of flying reptiles, filling every aerial niche you can imagine. But despite all that, most people still think of Pteranodon, the classic pterosaur, as the default model. And even then, we've misunderstood. Pteranodon, for example, didn't have teeth. Despite its name meaning toothless wing, it's often shown in media with a mouth full of sharp fangs. And it wasn't small, with a wingspan over 20 feet. It was one of the larger pterosaurs. It had a long backward sweeping crest, possibly for stability during flight or sexual display. It was likely a proficient fish eater, using its long beak to grab prey near the ocean surface, possibly skimming while in flight or diving like a pelican. Then there's Quetzalcoatlus, the towering giraffe-sized pterosaur that defies logic. Its wingspan may have exceeded 35 feet, yet it stood as tall as a giraffe when on land. For years, people assumed it couldn't actually fly. How could something so big even get off the ground? But biomechanical studies suggest it could launch using quadrupedal takeoff, pushing off with both its powerful legs and arms at once. Like a bat, its hollow bones and strong flight muscles allowed it to become airborne with explosive force. It probably soared over long distances, crossing ancient inland seas in search of carrion or small prey on land. still think it's just a dinosaur with wings? The truth is, pterosaurs are often overshadowed by dinosaurs, probably because they didn't leave quite as many fossilized bones. Their light, hollow skeletons don't fossilize as easily, which makes them harder to study. But when we do find them, they open windows into a completely different world, a world where the skies were alive with creatures. No bird or bat has ever rivaled that, so why does it matter that they weren't dinosaurs? Because lumping them in with dinosaurs erases their uniqueness. Dinosaurs were largely ground-bound, with the eventual exception of birds. Pterosaurs were aerial pioneers. They were the first vertebrates to truly conquer the skies. And they did it in a completely different way than birds or bats. Pterosaurs were not evolutionary stepping stones. They were peak performers of their own kind. They didn't lead to birds. They weren't proto-birds. They were a successful, sprawling branch of the tree of life that just happened to be living at the same time as the dinosaurs. And yes, like the dinosaurs, they went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, about 66 million years ago. The asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs didn't just hit the land. It sent shockwaves through the air, oceans, and atmosphere, and with it, the skies lost their most magnificent gliders. But here's the kicker. When you see a bird today, you're seeing a dinosaur's legacy. When you see a bat, that's a mammal that evolved flight on a completely separate track. But when you think about flight before birds, before bats, before bees or butterflies, you have to go back to the first vertebrate flyers. And that means the pterosaurs, not dinosaurs, not flying lizards, but their own category of incredible. So next time you see one in a movie, soaring alongside a T-Rex or dive-bombing a Jeep, remember this. You're not looking at a dinosaur. You're looking at a master of the sky, a creature with its own evolutionary story, its own triumphs, and its own mystery. They didn't walk like dinosaurs. They didn't roar like them. And they certainly didn't belong in the same box. They were something else entirely, and that, in the end, makes them even more fascinating. Chapter 5. The real Triceratops. The image is familiar. A three-horned, tank-like beast standing its ground against the mighty Tyrannosaurus rex. One last heroic charge, the prehistoric showdown. Two titans colliding in a dusty plain beneath volcanic skies. Triceratops, the noble herbivore, the final defense in a dangerous world. It's dramatic, it's powerful, and it's not entirely wrong. But the real Triceratops was more than a prop in T-Rex's spotlight. More than just a horned pinata for carnivores to bite into. It was an intelligent, socially complex, and powerfully built creature with a story that's been largely overlooked. The truth is, Triceratops may have been one of the most formidable animals to walk the earth, not despite being a plant eater, but because of it. Let's start with what we think we know. Triceratops horridus, the species most people are familiar with, lived during the very end of the Cretaceous period, around 68 to 66 million years ago, in what's now North America. It shared its world with some of the most famous dinosaurs, including Ankylosaurus, Edmontosaurus, and yes, Tyrannosaurus rex. But far from being passive prey, Triceratops was equipped for survival in a brutal competitive ecosystem. It was about 30 feet long, 10 feet tall at the shoulder, and weighed up to 12 tons, heavier than a bull African elephant. Its skull alone could reach 7 feet in length, with 3 iconic horns, 2 above the eyes and 1 on the snout. And behind that fearsome face, a massive frill, shaped like a medieval shield, extending from the back of the skull like a protective collar. But that frill wasn't just for armor. For a long time, paleontologists believed Triceratops used its frill solely for defense, a shield against the bone-crushing bite of T-Rex or the claws of a predator. And while it certainly offered protection, especially for the neck and shoulders, recent research suggests a more nuanced purpose. The frill and the horns may have also served as social signals. just like antlers on a deer or the mane of a lion. They were likely used to attract mates, assert dominance, and establish identity within the herd. Some fossils show signs of damage and healing, scars from headbutting matches or horn clashes with rivals. These weren't fatal wounds, they were bruises from battles for status. A prehistoric version of sparring. It paints a different picture of Triceratops. Not just a passive grazer, but an animal with a complex social structure, one that lived in groups, raised young, and competed for leadership in displays of strength and resilience. Imagine a herd of them, dozens of horned giants moving across the floodplains, their heads low, horns gleaming in the sun, frills shimmering with vascular color like those of modern lizards or birds, a wall of bone and muscle. And you begin to understand why Triceratops wasn't just a target, it was a presence. And those horns? Not just for show, each one over 3 feet long, made of solid keratin-covered bone. They could puncture, gore, and impale with terrifying force. In fact, we have fossil evidence of T-Rex skulls with puncture wounds in just the right places to match. A Triceratops horn. Not imagined scenes, actual damage on real fossilized bone. And here's the kicker. Triceratops didn't just survive in the same environment as T-Rex. It thrived. It was one of the most common large herbivores of the late Cretaceous. Fossils have been found across the western United States, from Montana to New Mexico. And not just single individuals, entire bone beds, suggesting that Triceratops may have lived in herds, possibly migrating or clustering during seasonal changes. Alone flips the old narrative, because for decades, we imagined them as solitary beasts, wandering through forests alone, munching ferns until something bigger showed up. But now, with more fossil evidence and behavioral comparisons to modern herbivores, we're seeing a different creature entirely. Alert, intelligent, cooperative, and strategic. Its beak, too, was a weapon. Sharp and powerful, it could shear through tough plant material. The dental battery behind it, rows of constantly replacing teeth, worked like a scissor mill, grinding down fibrous plants with mechanical efficiency. And those jaw muscles? Enormous. The animal may have used its mouth to not just feed, but defend, biting as a last resort. Its eyesight? Forward-facing, likely with some binocular overlap. That suggests depth perception, essential for positioning those horns in combat. And it had a large olfactory bulb, indicating a good sense of smell, possibly for identifying family members or sensing predators at a distance. Let's talk speed. No. Triceratops wasn't fast, not in the way a predator was. But it didn't need to be. It had mass. It had momentum. Think about a modern rhino. Bulky, yes, but when it charges, it becomes unstoppable. Now scale that up by several tons. You don't want to be in the way of a charging Triceratops. And for all its brawn, there's something quietly beautiful about this animal. Its fossils suggest it matured slowly, taking many years to reach full size. Juvenile skulls show smaller, more rounded horns that grew longer and curved as the animal aged. This has led scientists to reclassify several previously named species, like Torosaurus, as possibly just older Triceratops. It's a rare glimpse into dinosaur aging, a window into how looks changed over time. In that sense, the frill and horns weren't just for show or defense. They were a timeline, a visible sign of age, health, and identity, just as a peacock's tail or a stag's rack tells a story. And all of this adds up to a truth that's far more compelling than the movies, because while Hollywood has often reduced Triceratops to a noble side character, a victim, a background grazer, a quiet casualty, the reality is far more dynamic. It was one of the most successful herbivores in Earth's history. An animal that not only evolved to survive, but to compete, to thrive, to protect its own, and to shape its environment through sheer presence. When the asteroid struck, And the age of dinosaurs came crashing to an end. Triceratops was still there. It was one of the last non-avian dinosaurs, living right up until the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event. It saw the rise and fall of many species. It walked alongside T-Rex not in fear, but as a peer, as an equal player in the final chapter of the Mesozoic era. And perhaps that's what makes it truly unforgettable. It wasn't flashy. It didn't fly, it didn't roar, but it endured, it adapted. It fought. It survived longer than almost any other. And when we dig up those massive skulls, carefully extracting them from beds of rock laid down millions of years ago, we're not just uncovering bones. We're meeting a survivor. Chapter 6, Carnotaurus, the demon with tiny arms. If you could sculpt a dinosaur from a fever dream, a predator that looked more like a fantasy villain than a real animal, you might end up with something very close to Carnotaurus. It didn't just look strange, it looked wrong. Horns above its eyes, a devilish snarl frozen in bone, a deep chest, slender legs, and arms so hilariously small they make T-Rex look like a gym rat. And yet, behind that bizarre appearance was a creature built for speed, power, and possibly even ambush. A predator whose strange anatomy has puzzled and amazed paleontologists for decades. First discovered in 1984 by legendary Argentine paleontologist José Bonaparte, Carnotaurus sastre is one of South America's most iconic dinosaur finds. Its name means meat-eating bull, a reference to those prominent horns jutting from its skull. And let's be clear, no other large carnivorous dinosaur looked quite like this. This wasn't just another theropod, that was something altogether different. Let's start with the obvious. Those horns. Most predatory dinosaurs had ridges or crests. Maybe a bony boss or a nose bump, but Carnotaurus, it had thick, forward-facing horns that looked like they belonged to a bison. Fossils show that these weren't ornamental flourishes. They were made of solid bone and firmly fused to the skull. But what were they for? Some scientists believe they may have been used in head-to-head combat, not unlike modern-day goats or sheep. Perhaps rival Carnotaurus males butted heads for dominance, territory, or mates. But there's a catch. Their skulls weren't built for heavy impacts. So maybe the horns were more for display or threat posturing, like warning signs. Back off, I'm not worth the fight. Now look down the body, and things get even weirder. The arms of Carnotaurus are legendary, and not in a flattering way. They are the smallest arms relative to body size of any large carnivorous dinosaur ever discovered. Barely more than stumps, they were shorter than a human child's forearm. Unlike T-Rex, which at least had strong shoulder muscles and functional fingers, Carnotaurus had no wrists, no elbows, and hands that couldn't grasp anything. It's possible these arms served no purpose at all, evolutionary leftovers from an earlier ancestor. Or maybe, just maybe, they had a specialized function we haven't yet uncovered. Were they used during mating? For balance during turning? For visual signaling in some unknown behavioral context? The truth is, we simply don't know. But where Carnotaurus lacks in arms, it overcompensates in other ways. Its body was built like a race car. It had a deep chest, narrow hips, and long muscular legs. Its tail was reinforced with a unique system of interlocking bones and tendons, forming a sort of muscular springboard. This wasn't for balance, like in most theropods. This was power storage. It let the tail act like a lever, helping the legs deliver explosive bursts of speed. Some scientists estimate Carnotaurus could reach speeds of 30 to 35 miles per hour, faster than most predators its size. It may have been one of the fastest large theropods ever, and speed, combined with stealth, may have been its most important tool. Fossil evidence suggests it hunted in open or lightly forested areas, likely stalking slower herbivores like titanosaurs or ornithopods. Its skull, although tall and narrow, had forward-facing eyes that suggest stereoscopic vision. the kind that allows depth perception and accurate tracking. A perfect setup for a creature that needed to ambush, not overpower. But here's the twist. Carnotaurus didn't just rely on speed or brute force. Its skin, preserved with stunning detail in fossil impressions, tells another part of the story. Unlike many other theropods, we found large sections of its fossilized skin. And it's covered in rows of small, pebbly scales, punctuated by larger, bony studs known as scutes. These weren't armor in the traditional sense. They wouldn't deflect claws or teeth, but they would have given Carnotaurus a rough, reptilian texture. Some paleontologists believe this scaly skin pattern may have helped break up its outline, like natural camouflage. Not unlike a crocodile lurking in dappled shadows out in life. It might have been dark-colored, possibly reddish or patterned, blending into its environment as it crept low and fast through the brush. And while Carnotaurus wasn't the largest predator of its time, it was certainly among the most specialized. It lived during the late Cretaceous, around 70 million years ago, in what is now Argentina. It shared its ecosystem with massive long-necked sauropods, armored ankylosaurs, and smaller predatory rivals, but it seems to have filled a very specific niche, the fast-horned sprinter, capable of short, violent charges and quick kills, and yet, it's still often remembered, unfairly, as the dinosaur with the stupid arms. That's the thing about Carnotaurus. Its weirdness tends to overshadow its brilliance. The sounds were not the movie-style roars we're used to. They were more like haunting, low-frequency bellows, long, echoing tones that could travel for miles across open landscapes. These weren't random noises. They were likely communication tools. Think about it. Hadrosaurs lived in herds, large ones, moving across vast plains and forests. Visual cues only go so far. But sound works in fog, in darkness, over distance. A deep bellow could signal danger, attraction, separation, or cohesion, like elephants do today. It's not far-fetched to say that hadrosaurs may have had dialects, different tones for different species, even individuals. Imagine a chorus of ancient voices echoing across the landscape, low, rumbling notes woven through the ferns and conifers. And the possibilities don't end there. Some paleontologists believe that sexual selection played a role in crest development, that males may have evolved larger or differently shaped crests to stand out, the same way peacocks display feathers or frogs use song. Perhaps a larger crest meant a deeper, more resonant call, a more impressive serenade to potential mates. But the crests weren't the only clue to hadrosaur sophistication. Their brains, at least in some species, were surprisingly advanced. Not on the level of predators like Truden, but big enough to suggest complex behavior. And their inner ears? They were tuned to low-frequency sounds, exactly the kind they might have produced. That's the kind of evolutionary harmony you don't get by accident. And yet, despite all this, hadrosaurs still get branded as boring, bland, the salad bar of the dinosaur world. But let's dig a little deeper. Some hadrosaurs, like Edmontosaurus, could grow over 40 feet long, the size of a city bus. Others were smaller, nimbler. They lived across a vast range of environments, from the swamps of North America to the uplands of Asia. Some even roamed the Arctic during periods of milder climate, enduring long months of darkness, possibly migrating or hibernating in massive groups. They traveled in herds that may have numbered in the hundreds or thousands. Fossilized trackways show coordinated movement, with adults and juveniles side by side. Some sites even show nesting grounds, places where they laid eggs, protected hatchlings, and maybe even raised young communally. In other words, hadrosaurs weren't just passive grazers. They were social animals. Intelligent, vocal, mobile, and organized, and they were survivors. Hadrosaurs were among the last dinosaurs to roam the earth. They made it all the way to the final curtain. the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event. When the asteroid hit 66 million years ago, hadrosaurs were still thriving. They'd outlasted rival groups, spread across continents, and adapted to dozens of niches. They were the ultimate generalists, the kind of animal that doesn't need flashy teeth or claws to dominate, just the right tools, the right brains, the right voice, and that voice might have been beautiful. Imagine standing at the edge of a prehistoric lake. The sun is rising through the mist. A herd of Brachiosaurus grazes nearby, their crests catching the light like polished bone. One raises its head, and a low horn-like note flows through the air. Haunting, ancient, almost musical. Another answers. Then another. And for a moment, it feels like a symphony. Not of terror, but of life. The idea that these animals, long thought to be simple or dull, were capable of something like song, reshapes the way we see dinosaurs. It strips away the monster label. It replaces it with something more intimate, more connected, because sound is emotional. Sound is memory. And if hadrosaurs had voices, they had personalities. They had relationships. They had stories. Stories were only just beginning to hear. Chapter 9. Raptors were colorful, not gray. When you hear the word raptor, what image comes to mind? Most likely, a snarling, scaly, gray-skinned killer, jaws open, claws poised, eyes glowing with malice. Maybe it's stalking through a jungle, maybe flanking a hapless tourist in a kitchen. The image has burned itself into pop culture, sleek, sinister, and shockingly uniform. But science tells us something completely different. The real raptors, the dromaeosaurs, weren't just smart and deadly. They were feathered. And not just with a few tufts here and there. We're talking fully plumed, bird-like hunters, some of which may have been decked out in patterns, stripes, and even iridescent hues. In other words, the real raptors didn't look like movie monsters. They looked like killer birds, beautiful, agile, and flamboyant. Let's rewind. The first major clue came in the 1990s, when fossils from China's Liaoning province began to surface. Exquisitely preserved skeletons of small theropods with clear feather impressions. One of the most famous? Microraptor, a small four-winged raptor with flight feathers not just on its arms, but on its legs and tail. It looked like a crow crossed with a dragonfly, and it definitely wasn't gray. Then came Velociraptor. Yes, that Velociraptor. In 2007, a specimen was discovered in Mongolia with clear quill knobs on the forearm bones, just like the anchor points that birds have for flight feathers. That wasn't a guess. That was physical evidence that Velociraptor had wings, or at least feathered arms. This was no longer theoretical. It was confirmed. And once that door opened, a whole world of possibilities came flooding in. Suddenly, paleontologists were reevaluating everything, from the way raptors moved to how they hunted, how they stayed warm, how they raised their young, and yes, how they looked. And the answer was dazzling. Feathers aren't just for flight. They serve many functions: insulation, display, camouflage, communication. Modern birds use color to attract mates, intimidate rivals, or blend into their surroundings. Why would raptors be any different? In fact, using techniques like melanosome analysis, scientists have begun to reconstruct the actual colors of some dinosaur feathers. Microraptor, for instance, appears to have been glossy black with an iridescent sheen, like a raven. Others, like Anchiornis, showed patterns of black and white, with rusty red crests. These weren't drab animals. They were walking works of art. And let's not forget the environment. The late Cretaceous wasn't a colorless world. It was lush, varied, and vibrant, filled with flowering plants, insects, and shifting light. In that world, color had meaning. Flashy feathers might have signaled health, dominance, or territory. Or they might have helped a predator blend into dappled forest shadows. So imagine this: a Deinonychus, cousin of Velociraptor, crouching low in the undergrowth, Its feathers striped in browns and golds like a hawk, tail lifted for balance, wings out for intimidation. It moves like a dancer, light, precise, coiled with energy. And when it lunges, it's not a lizard pouncing. It's a bird of prey with teeth. Because yes, even though they were covered in feathers, raptors were still very much reptilian at their core. They had sharp teeth, strong jaws, and of course, that legendary killing claw, the sickle-shaped toe claw they held aloft while running, ready to slash down into flesh. They likely hunted in complex ways, not always in packs like wolves, as movies suggest, but sometimes using intelligence, agility, and even coordination in smaller groups. Some may have ambushed prey. Others might have leapt from above. All of them were built for motion, light skeletons, long tails for balance, limbs adapted for both speed and grappling. And those feathers? They didn't slow them down. They may have enhanced their maneuverability, like the tail feathers of a cheetah helping to steer in mid-sprint. The closer you look, the more modern they seem. Their skeletons share so many traits with birds: hollow bones, wishbone-like clavicles, lung structures that suggest one-way airflow. Their brooding behavior, nesting over eggs, guarding them with feathery arms, was almost identical to that of modern birds. And yet, despite this, our image of them remains stuck in the 1990s. Gray, leathery, uniform. Why? Because the movies made them that way. When Jurassic Park hit theaters in 1993, it changed everything. And to be fair, it was groundbreaking. It introduced millions of people to the idea of dinosaurs as smart, fast, and bird-like. But it stopped short of feathers, in part because the science was still catching up, and in part because scaly monsters just looked scarier on screen. But now we know better, and once you start seeing raptors as colorful, bird-like, and emotionally complex, you start seeing them differently altogether. Imagine a young velociraptor preening its feathers in the sun, an older one displaying vibrant plumage during a mating ritual, two siblings squabbling with vocalizations, not screeches, but hisses, coos, or low trills, their eyes sharp, their movements precise, their bodies alive with detail. Does it make them less scary? Maybe, but it makes them real. It also reshapes the whole narrative of evolution. Because raptors weren't just the top-tier hunters of their time. They were the bridge between the age of reptiles and the age of birds. Some of their descendants may have survived the asteroid impact, shrinking, adapting, and eventually taking to the skies. Today, when you look at a hawk, a crow, or even a pigeon, you're looking at a living echo of those ancient, feathered killers. You're looking at a raptor that made it. That's the twist no one saw coming, because the real legacy of raptors isn't claws or cunning or cold-blooded killing. It's adaptability. It's that they weren't gray, they weren't lizards. They were vibrant, warm-blooded, socially complex animals that didn't just survive. They evolved. They sang, they displayed, they dazzled. And in the end, they flew. Chapter 10. What dinosaurs really sounded like in the movies. Dinosaurs roar. They screech. They bellow. They unleash guttural, bone-rattling growls that shake the earth and chill the spine. But here's the truth. Almost everything we think we know about dinosaur sounds is pure fiction, because the real voices of dinosaurs were likely far stranger, more alien, more subtle, more unlike anything we've ever heard in a film. No dramatic roars echoing through jungles, no thunderous Godzilla howls. Instead, ancient soundscape was probably filled with booms, hisses, coos, grunts, and deep, resonant pulses that didn't just echo, they vibrated. And in that world, silence wasn't absence. It was mystery. Why is this such a blank spot in our knowledge? Because sound doesn't fossilize. We have bones. We have footprints. We even have skin, feathers, and stomach contents. But we don't have recordings. We can't play back the cries of a mother hadrosaur calling to her young. We can't hear the territorial warning of a T-Rex. All we have are clues, subtle hints left behind in the anatomy, in the structure of skulls and airways, and in comparisons with modern animals. And when you follow those clues, the results are startling. Let's start with the basics. Most of the roars you've heard in films, like the iconic T-Rex bellow in Jurassic Park, were created in sound design studios using mashups of tigers, alligators, elephants, and even slowed down tortoise mating calls. They sound epic. They sound terrifying, but they're probably completely wrong. The first problem is mechanics. To produce a lion-like roar, you need a very specific set of vocal anatomy, vocal cords, vocal sacs, air-splitting folds. And we don't actually have strong evidence that non-avian dinosaurs had these exact features, but we do know they had air sacs. Birds and some dinosaurs share a complex respiratory system involving hollow bones and internal air sacs. This not only helped them breathe efficiently, but may have also helped them produce sound in a completely different way. Birds don't roar. They don't use vocal cords. They use something called a syrinx, a vocal organ located at the base of the trachea. It's an incredibly efficient, flexible system that allows them to produce multiple sounds at once. That's how a songbird can create complex melodies, or a raven can mimic human speech. And here's the game changer. In 2016, scientists identified the first known fossil syrinx from a bird-like dinosaur called Vegavis IA. It lived during the late Cretaceous, and it had a vocal structure almost identical to that of modern birds, which means at least some dinosaurs sang. They didn't growl. They whistled, trilled, or honked, depending on the species. They communicated through complex, possibly beautiful, soundscapes. Imagine the haunting, low-frequency call of a hadrosaur echoing across a prehistoric lake, or the rhythmic coo of a feathered raptor hidden in the underbrush, or the deep, chesty boom of a territorial display, not heard but felt in the bones. Some of these sounds may have even operated below the range of human hearing, like elephants or cassowaries today, using infrasound to communicate across long distances. Cassowaries are a particularly interesting comparison. These large, flightless birds, often considered living dinosaurs, produce incredibly low frequency booms. The sound isn't always audible, but it creates a vibration in the air, a physical sensation. Some paleontologists believe large dinosaurs, like T-Rex or sauropods, may have used similar low-frequency pulses to communicate, possibly for territory, mating, or warning calls. In fact, when we examine the skull of T-Rex, we see large sinus cavities and resonating chambers. These weren't just empty space. They could have amplified deep, reverberating vocalizations, not loud, but penetrating. Less king of the jungle roar, more subwoofer of death. And think about this. Even crocodiles, one of the closest living relatives of dinosaurs, produce low bellows that vibrate through water and ground. They don't have vocal cords either, yet they can rumble, growl, and even bark to warn rivals or attract mates. So dinosaurs had the anatomical tools. But what would they use them for? That's where behavior comes in. Dinosaurs weren't just loud for the sake of being loud. Sound in the animal kingdom is communication, warning, attraction, coordination, defense. Take hadrosaurs again, with their trumpet-like crests. Studies using 3D models of Parasaurolophus's nasal passage have shown it could produce long, eerie, low-frequency tones. These weren't random honks. They were specific, repeatable, resonant calls, likely used to identify individuals, find mates, or keep a herd together in low visibility. Or imagine a pair of therizinosaurs displaying to each other, feathers puffed, bodies swaying, letting out rhythmic huffs like ground-dwelling birds during mating season. Even small raptors may have had calls, sharp warning yelps, subtle location clicks, or even mimicry of prey species. as some birds of prey do today. And then there's silence. Some predators in the modern world hunt without making a sound. Owls, for instance, are engineered for stealth. It's possible that not every dinosaur needed or used sound frequently. Some may have been silent stalkers. Others might have relied more on visual cues or chemical signals. We'll never know for sure, but the diversity of potential is mind-boggling. Here single quotes s a thought that lingers. The Mesozoic era wasn't just a world of thunderous footsteps and crashing battles. It was likely filled with sound, strange, subtle, sometimes soothing, sometimes terrifying. A forest alive with the murmur of herbivores. A low moan rolling across the plains. A sharp chirp in the darkness. A rhythmic boom echoing through the ferns. If we could stand in the middle of that world and just listen, it might feel more like being in a rainforest than a war zone. Layers of sound. Communication layered on survival. Emotion layered on instinct, not chaos. But chorus, that's the tragedy of film fiction. We've imagined dinosaurs as beasts, stripped of nuance, reduced to howls and screams. But when we uncover their voices, we uncover something deeper. Evidence of relationships, intelligence, emotion. A mother calling to her hatchlings. A juvenile testing its voice. Two rivals dueling in sound before resorting to violence. A world not of noise, but of meaning. And it makes you wonder, if we heard the true voice of a dinosaur, would we even recognize it as animal? Or would it sound so strange, so otherworldly, that we'd think it was something else entirely? Whatever the case, one thing is clear: dinosaurs didn't sound like the movies. They sounded like dinosaurs. And that sound, lost in time, might be the one thing we're still learning how to hear. Chapter 11. Stegosaurus, the wrong-headed dinosaur. It's hard to find a more instantly recognizable dinosaur than Stegosaurus. Those tall, bony plates rising like sails along its back. The Thagomizer, a name we owe to a comic strip, jutting from the tail like a medieval weapon. The tiny head, the arched back, the dragging tail. You've seen it on lunchboxes, in cartoons, parading through dioramas with all the elegance of a spiky armored tank. But what if we told you that for over a century, nearly everything about how we imagined Stegosaurus was wrong? And we're not just talking about behavior or diet. At one point, we literally put its head on the wrong end. Let's start at the beginning. When Stegosaurus was first discovered in 1877 by the legendary Othniel Charles Marsh during the infamous Bone Wars, it presented paleontologists with a bizarre puzzle. Enormous back plates, stumpy legs, a tiny skull, and that brutal tail. Marsh described it as an armored lizard, hence the name Stegosaurus, meaning roofed lizard. He thought the plates laid flat along the back like shingles on a roof. A reasonable mistake if your understanding of dinosaur anatomy is in its infancy. But the errors didn't stop there. In early reconstructions, the Stegosaurus was imagined with a dragging tail, a sprawling lizard-like posture, and sometimes even the wrong skull entirely, mistakenly attaching skulls from other herbivorous dinosaurs to its body because the real head was so small and delicate. It didn't seem to fit. For years, scientists genuinely debated whether the brain of a Stegosaurus was too small to control its own body. One bizarre theory proposed that it had a second brain in its hips, a sort of backup control center to help coordinate its massive frame. This idea stuck around for decades, despite having no real evidence. But modern paleontology has done what it does best: shattered myths and rewritten the narrative. So let's set the record straight. The real Stegosaurus was not a slow-witted, tail-dragging reptile with flat plates and a mystery brain in its rear. It was a highly adapted, highly specialized herbivore with a form of defense so effective, it likely made predators think twice. Let's talk about those plates. At first, no one could figure out what they were for. Defense? Camouflage? A solar Panel. In truth, the plates, made of bone and covered in a keratinous sheath, likely served multiple purposes. Positioned in a staggered, alternating pattern, not flat, they created a striking silhouette that may have helped in species recognition, mate attraction or intimidation. And yes, they may have helped regulate body temperature. The plates were filled with blood vessels, suggesting they could act like radiators, absorbing heat or shedding it, depending on environmental conditions. But that's not the whole story. Think of a deer's antlers or a peacock's feathers, structures that evolved not just for function, but for display. Stegosaurus may have used its plates to signal health, maturity, or dominance. In a world where communication wasn't vocal, visual signals were everything. But what about the thagomizer, that wicked tail weapon? Here's the wild part. For years, many paleontologists assumed it wasn't used in combat, that it was just for show. But then came the fossil evidence. Damaged tail vertebrae, pathological spikes, and most notably, Allosaurus bones with puncture wounds that perfectly matched the spacing of Stegosaurus spikes. That was the smoking gun. The thagomizer was not just real, it was lethal. A swinging tail with 4 sharpened spikes, capable of maiming or even killing a predator. It didn't need speed, it had reach. And when you factor in the articulation of the tail, which was more flexible and muscular than once believed, it becomes clear that Stegosaurus had an incredibly effective rear-facing defense system. In other words, mess with its back and you might get skewered. But let's come back to that tiny head, the one that caused so much confusion in the early days. Yes, Stegosaurus had one of the smallest brains relative to body size of any known dinosaur. Its brain was around the size of a lime, controlling a body over 20 feet long, and yet it survived. It thrived for millions of years. So how? Because intelligence, in the way we define it, isn't always the point in evolution. Stegosaurus didn't need cleverness, it needed efficiency. A low center of gravity, defensive armor, a weaponized tail, and a digestive system built to extract nutrients from tough, fibrous plants, possibly aided by swallowed stones or symbiotic gut bacteria. Its tiny head housed a narrow beak and peg-like teeth, not for chewing, but for snipping and cropping. It probably relied on a fermentation chamber in its gut to break down plant material, much like cows do today. And as for movement, forget the slow, dragging posture of early illustrations. Fossil trackways show that Stegosaurus walked upright, with its tail held off the ground. It moved with a slow but deliberate gait, likely in small groups or solitary, browsing for low vegetation. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. Its defense was built in. Its armor spoke for itself. But what makes Stegosaurus so fascinating isn't just its physical form. It's what it represents. A cautionary tale about assumption, about how our earliest ideas about dinosaurs were shaped more by human imagination than scientific evidence. We imagined them as giant lizards, cold-blooded, dim-witted monsters. But Stegosaurus, misunderstood from the beginning, helped teach us to question those assumptions, to dig deeper. Literally and metaphorically, over time we've pieced together a new vision, a creature that was strange, yes, but perfectly evolved for its time. A tank with solar panels, a gentle browser with tail blades, a dinosaur that didn't need speed or brains or ferocity to be a success, and maybe most importantly, a dinosaur that never stopped evolving in our minds, because even today, as new fossils are uncovered and old theories are overturned, Stegosaurus continues to surprise us. It's a reminder that science isn't static, that the story is never really over. Even when the skeletons are laid out in museum halls, silent and still, their real story is still being written. And in the case of Stegosaurus, that story just happens to begin with one of the most famous wrong guesses in dinosaur history, putting its head on the wrong end. Chapter 12. Sauropods weren't swamp monsters. They were the largest animals to ever walk the earth, stretching longer than buses, towering taller than giraffes, and weighing more than a herd of elephants. Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, Brachiosaurus, Argentinosaurus, names that echo like ancient thunder, but for decades, we pictured them the same way, slow, dim, and dragging themselves through murky swamps to support their impossible bulk. They were always half submerged, their heads barely above water, their tails trailing behind like limp ropes. Too big for land, too dumb to survive on their own. They weren't just dinosaurs. They were monsters of burden. But here's the truth, that image? It's a fossil itself, a relic of outdated science and Victorian assumptions. The real sauropods were not swamp-bound behemoths. They were powerful, graceful, and fully terrestrial animals that ruled the landscape with sheer presence. And the more we've studied them, the more incredible they've become. Let's unravel the myth, one piece at a time. The swamp life for most of the 20th century. Paleontologists believed sauropods were too heavy to support their own weight on dry land. Their legs looked column-like and their bodies massive, so it was assumed they must have used water to buoy themselves up, like living zeppelins. But this was based less on evidence and more on what seemed logical at the time. No living land animal even approached their size, so it felt safer to stick them in a lake and let physics help them survive. However, the fossil record, as always, had something different to say. Sauropod trackways are found everywhere. Not just near lakes or rivers, but across plains, forests, deserts, landscapes far from any swamps. Their footprints show animals walking in herds, with confidence and direction. No signs of stumbling through mud or wading waist-deep through water. And their skeletons? Designed for land, their legs weren't splayed like a lizard's, they were vertical, like columns beneath a building. Their vertebrae were riddled with air sacs, lightening their massive frames and making them more like biological suspension bridges than overgrown reptiles. These weren't animals barely surviving. These were engineering masterpieces of evolution. Their long necks weren't just for browsing treetops. Some sauropods may have swept their heads across wide areas like living cranes, feeding across vast distances without moving their bodies. Others held their necks high, towering over the forest, scanning the horizon, and their tails? Far from dragging behind them, sauropods held their tails aloft. Some tails, especially in diplodocids, were long and whip-like, capable, according to some studies, of producing sonic booms when cracked. A weapon? A communication tool? A last line of defense? Possibly all three. Now think about the heart. How does an animal pump blood 20 feet up a neck to reach its brain? Early skeptics used this as proof that sauropods couldn't have held their heads high. But recent models suggest sauropods may have had powerful, multi-chambered hearts, as well as valves in the neck arteries to reduce strain. Some researchers even propose they had a unique blood pressure regulation system, allowing them to elevate and lower their heads without passing out. These weren't creatures crippled by their size. They were adapted to it, not so dumb theirs. Another popular belief, that sauropods were stupid. Tiny brains and massive bodies, right? Technically, yes. Their brains were small compared to their size. But that doesn't mean they were brainless. Intelligence isn't one size fits all. Elephants, for instance, are large and intelligent, but not because of brain-to-body ratio. Because of complex social behavior, memory, and communication. And sauropods may have been similar in some ways. Evidence suggests many sauropods traveled in herds, possibly with age structure, juveniles in the middle, protected by adults. Nesting sites have been discovered that hint at seasonal migration. And mass egg-laying events, not unlike sea turtles or flamingos today. These weren't solitary lumbering giants. They were part of communities, moving, feeding, possibly even protecting each other. And let's not forget their early growth. Sauropods, hatched from eggs barely the size of a football. To reach adulthood, they had to grow at unbelievable speeds, packing on tons of mass within a few decades. That kind of growth rate implies high metabolism, efficient digestion, and a biology that's more bird-like than cold-blooded lizard. In other words, sauropods weren't sluggish. They were fast-growing, heat-retaining, ecological GUGERNAUTS. Giants on the move, wherever you go in the fossil record. South America, North America, Africa, Asia. Sauropods are there, and they're everywhere. From the long-necked Velociraptors of China to the truly colossal Dinosaurs, estimated at nearly 100 feet long and weighing over 70 tons. These animals dominated ecosystems. They were the ultimate plant eaters, grazers of the sky, bulldozers with elegance, and they weren't trapped in swamps. They strode across open floodplains. They browsed the tops of conifer forests. They crossed dry plains in massive herds, their footfalls pounding into the ground like nature's own drumbeat. And wherever they went, they shaped the land. They trampled paths, altered vegetation, and recycled nutrients. They weren't just part of the ecosystem, they were the ecosystem. Seeing them, anew modern reconstructions now show sauropods as active, alert, land-roaming giants, not awkward waterlogged beasts. Their skin may have been covered in scales, some with dermal spines or armor-like textures. Some may have had coloration, patterns for camouflage or display. They weren't gray by default. They weren't stupid by assumption. They were living animals, each species finely tuned to its niche. And now, we're even beginning to glimpse the soft tissue features that never fossilized, the cheeks that shaped their mouths, the air sacs that made them lighter, the nasal structures that may have let them vocalize with deep, rumbling calls that resonated across the land. Imagine hearing that. A low, sonorous note vibrating through your chest. A sauropod song, not a roar, but a presence. Asterisk. That's the tragedy of the old swamp monster myth. It robbed these creatures of their grandeur, but the reality is so much better. Because in a world that keeps trying to limit the possible, sauropods are the ultimate contradiction. Creatures so big they shouldn't have been able to walk, and yet they walked across continents. So no, they weren't swamp monsters. They were living towers, gentle nomads, biological wonders, creatures so strange and beautiful that the earth may never see their like again. And all of it happened in broad daylight, on dry land. Chapter 13. The real Spinosaurus was a swimmer. Let's be honest. When you think of the most fearsome dinosaurs, your mind probably jumps to Tyrannosaurus rex. But what if we told you there was a predator even bigger, even stranger? One that didn't just walk the earth, but ruled the rivers? Meet Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, a creature so bizarre, so utterly unexpected, that even paleontologists were skeptical when its true form started to take shape. Because Spinosaurus wasn't just a land-based hunter with a flashy sail on its back. It was the world's first known aquatic dinosaur. And that single fact changes everything. Let's start with what the movies got wrong. In Jurassic Park 3, Spinosaurus bursts onto the screen as a towering brute. It walks like a taller, leaner T-Rex with overdeveloped arms and a crocodile's snarl. It even kills a T-Rex in one-on-one combat. A controversial scene, to say the least. But the real animal was something far more fascinating. It wasn't built for duels on dry land. It was built for ambush, stealth, and power in water. Its very anatomy screams adaptation, but not for the open plains. For the river deltas and swampy coastlines of ancient North Africa. This is where the story gets wild. The first Spinosaurus fossils were uncovered in Ozengogets Wild, Egypt in 1912 by German paleontologist Ernst Stromer. He described the enormous sail-backed predator based on partial remains, and then, in a tragic twist, those fossils were destroyed during a bombing raid in World War II. For decades, Spinosaurus remained a mystery. Just a few drawings, a name, a shadow. Then in the early 2000s, new fossils began surfacing, first in Morocco, then in other parts of North Africa. And what they revealed stunned the scientific world. Long, narrow jaws filled with conical teeth, perfect for gripping. Slippery prey. Elongated neural spines rising from the back like a ship's sail. Dense, compact limb bones, more like those of manatees or penguins than terrestrial dinosaurs. And most dramatically of all, a flattened tail, flexible and paddle-like, capable of undulating through water like a crocodile. That tail changed everything. In 2020, a team led by Dr. Naitzer Ibrahim unveiled a nearly complete tail of Spinosaurus. And it wasn't stiff or dragging like other theropods. It was built for propulsion, a swimming tail. On a dinosaur. For the first time, we had physical evidence that Spinosaurus wasn't just hunting near water. It was living in it. A dinosaur. That swam. Let that sink in. Because in the age of dinosaurs, nothing else quite like this had been seen. We had fish-eating pterosaurs, marine reptiles like plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, and of course, semi-aquatic crocodiliforms. But a fully aquatic dinosaur predator? That rewrote the rulebook. And it wasn't just the tail. Spinosaurus' skull was long and narrow, filled with pressure-sensing pits, the same kind seen in crocodiles, used to detect movement in water. Its nostrils were pushed further back on its snout, allowing it to breathe while partially submerged. Its center of mass was shifted forward, giving it stability in water, but making bipedal walking awkward on land. Some reconstructions now suggest it spent most of its life in the water, hunting giant fish, using its sail for display, or thermoregulation, and possibly dragging itself out like a massive, scaled-down bear to sunbathe or nest. It was the apex predator of the Cretaceous river systems, but it didn't hunt like T-Rex. It didn't chase. It didn't ambush from bushes. It waited, still, patient, a shadow beneath the surface. And then it struck. Its jaws clamped down not on other dinosaurs, but on prehistoric fish like Onchopristis, sawfish the size of cars, or lungfish or coelacanths. Its diet was aquatic. Its life was aquatic. And that sail? For years, it puzzled scientists. Too tall to be practical. Too thin to offer serious defense. But when placed in the context of water, it begins to make sense. Some paleontologists believe the sail may have acted as a visual signal, used to intimidate rivals, attract mates, or establish territory. In murky water or dense forest, such a towering display would have been impossible to miss. Others suggest it could have served as a thermal regulator, heating up in the sun or shedding heat rapidly, depending on blood flow. Or perhaps even as a hydrodynamic stabilizer, like the fin of a fish. One thing's certain, Spinosaurus didn't evolve that sail by accident. It was part of a suite of adaptations that turned it into one of the most unique predators Earth has ever seen. But why does this matter? Because Spinosaurus forces us to confront a broader truth. Dinosaurs were not bound by our assumptions. They weren't just giant lizards. They were diverse, experimental, adaptable. Some flew. Some glided. Some swam. And some, like Spinosaurus, carved out ecological niches that defied imagination. In fact, the ecosystems of Cretaceous North Africa were unlike any other. Giant fish, crocodiliforms, huge aquatic turtles, pterosaurs diving from the skies. And in the middle of it all, Spinosaurus, half crocodile, half dinosaur, all apex, a predator that ruled the rivers, not by brute force, but by evolution's sheer ingenuity. And here's a thought. Imagine you're standing at the edge of a Cretaceous river, the air thick with humidity, the trees buzzing with prehistoric insects. You hear a splash, a ripple, but you see nothing. And then, rising from the reeds, breaking the water's surface, a tall, jagged sail, moving closer, silently. Spinosaurus wasn't just the most misunderstood. Predator of its time. It was one of the strangest animals to ever live. And somehow, despite the odds, we're only now beginning to understand what it was. Not a brawler, not a land-walking beast, not a movie monster, but a swimmer, a specialist, a dinosaur that dared to be different and, for a time, ruled a world all its own. Chapter 14, Ankylosaurus. More than a walking tank, every story needs a tank. A juggernaut. A creature that doesn't run, doesn't flinch. It stands its ground. In dinosaur lore, that role belongs to Ankylosaurus. If you've ever seen one in a museum or a movie, you know the look. Low-slung, broad-backed, a living bulldozer covered in bony armor. And at the tail end, a massive club, capable of breaking bones and turning predators into regretful footnotes. But here's what most people don't realize. Ankylosaurus wasn't just a slow-moving block of defense. It was sophisticated, strategic, and full of surprises. This was not a dinosaur that just happened to survive, that it was built by nature with extreme precision. Let's start with the armor. From nose to tail, Ankylosaurus was covered in osteoderms, bony deposits embedded in the skin. These weren't random plates. They were arranged with intent. Along its back, large keeled plates interlocked like a medieval knight's mail, overlapping for maximum coverage. Smaller nodules covered the flanks and limbs. Even the eyelids were armored. Its skull, virtually indestructible. The bones were fused into a single unit, thickened and reinforced. This was a head made for surviving blows, or possibly delivering them. Now, about that tail club. Two massive knobs of bone, fused over time from modified vertebrae and connected to a handle-like series of tailbones. This wasn't just for show. CT scans of fossil tail clubs revealed dense bone and thick muscle attachment points. This was a weapon, and studies show it could deliver a blow with enough force to fracture bone, even those of a full-grown T-Rex. Think about that. You're a hungry predator, stalking prey, and you corner this low-slung herbivore. You charge, jaws open, but just before you land the bite, it pivots, and boom, the tail swings out like a battering ram. Your shin shatters. That's Ankylosaurus's real power. Not just surviving an attack, but ending it. But defense is just the beginning. Because Ankylosaurus wasn't dumb. It wasn't slow in the mind. In fact, some features suggest it may have had surprisingly keen senses, particularly smell. Its nasal passages were long, winding, and complex, almost maze-like. Not only did this help with thermoregulation and humidifying dry air, but it also likely housed a sophisticated olfactory system. In plain terms, Ankylosaurus may have had an excellent sense of smell. Why does that matter? Because good scent tracking means better awareness of food sources, better awareness of predators, better survival. And remember, Ankylosaurus lived in the late Cretaceous, sharing its environment with tyrannosaurs, raptors, and other large predators. It needed every edge it could get. Speaking of environment, let's talk habitat. Ankylosaurus fossils have been found across North America, particularly in places that once held dense forests and floodplains. It wasn't just wandering open plains like a steel-clad tractor. It was likely navigating wooded areas, brushing past ferns and underbrush, its armor scraping bark, its nostrils searching for the next patch of edible vegetation. And what it ate? Low-lying plants. Ankylosaurus had a wide, beak-like snout for cropping, and behind that, small leaf-shaped teeth. Not for chewing, but for clipping. Digestion probably took place over long periods, possibly aided by fermentation and gut bacteria. Like in modern herbivores, but here's a fascinating twist. Because when you look past the meme-worthy anatomy, you see an animal finely tuned for its world. It didn't need arms. It had a spring-loaded skeleton, vision adapted for precision, and a skull equipped with long, slender teeth ideal for slicing through flesh. It was more like than a bone crusher, built for hit-and-run strikes, not prolonged wrestling matches. And then, of course, there's the legacy. In pop culture, has finally started to get some attention. It appeared as a villain in Disney's Dinosaur and showed up again in the Jurassic World series. But even then, its portrayal is still wrapped in exaggeration, overly large, overly aggressive, and always a little too close to T-Rex in appearance. The real animal was stranger, smarter, sleeker, and far more alien, and maybe that's what makes it unforgettable, because Carnotaurus challenges our expectations. It defies our visual shorthand for what a predator should look like. It's a living contradiction, strong but strangely shaped, deadly but derpy looking, fast but horned like a herbivore. And when we imagine it not as a freak, but as a successful design, one honed by millions of years of evolutionary trial and error, we see it for what it was, a predator with a purpose, a demon in disguise. Glimpse into the strange possibilities of deep time, where survival doesn't always look the way we expect. Chapter 7. The Freddy Krueger Herbivore. Imagine walking through a dense prehistoric forest. The air is heavy, still. Something moves in the trees, slow, deliberate. Then you see it. A creature steps out of the undergrowth, towering over you like a nightmarish scarecrow, feathered, pot-bellied, long-necked. Its tiny head turns, curious. And then your eyes lock onto the real horror, arms stretching out, longer than your entire body, tipped with scythe-like claws over 3 feet long. Claws that could disembowel you in a single sweep. You brace for attack, and it starts munching on ferns. Welcome to the deeply confusing world of a dinosaur that looked like a killer and behaved like a gardener. It may be the single weirdest dinosaur ever discovered. When paleontologists first uncovered its fossils in the 1940s in Mongolia, they found something strange. Giant claws, each one longer than a human arm. At first, they assumed they belonged to some kind of massive predator. After all, what else would need weapons like that? Some even thought they belonged to a giant turtle. It took decades, and more fossil discoveries, to piece together the full picture. And when they finally did, what emerged was something no one saw coming. Was a member of a group called part of the theropod family, the same family that includes T-Rex, Velociraptor, and modern birds. But while most theropods were carnivorous, had taken a sharp turn. It was a herbivore. That's right. All those slashing claws, they weren't for gutting prey. They were likely used for pulling down branches, stripping leaves, or defending against predators. And maybe, just maybe, for mating displays or territory battles, but not for killing. Let's break down this walking contradiction. It stood around 10 meters, 33 feet, long and possibly up to 5 meters, 16 feet, tall. Its body was bulky and barrel-shaped, a plant processing machine. Its neck was long and flexible, ending in a small skull with a narrow, toothless beak, perfect for clipping vegetation. But those arms, oh those arms, they were grotesquely long, longer than any other theropods, and ended in claws that defy logic. Each one could measure up to 1 meter, over 3 feet. Not curved like a raptor's talon, but almost sickle-shaped, elegant in a disturbing way. Some paleontologists have compared them to scythes or mantis limbs. And yet, this thing was a plant-eater. It's like if Freddy Krueger gave up slashing teenagers and took up horticulture. Even its feet were weird. Most theropods had narrow, raptor-like feet built for speed, but had broad, weight-bearing toes, with claws shaped more like hooves. They weren't made for running. They were made for supporting serious weight, like that of a big, slow-moving grazer. And here's the twist. It was covered in feathers. Fossils of close relatives like Anothronychus show clear evidence of primitive feathers, hair-like filaments that covered the body. While we haven't found complete feathered specimens of Therizinosaurus itself, there's no reason to believe it was an exception. So yes, This nightmare-fueled beast was likely fluffy, maybe even colorful. Imagine a giant sloth-like creature, covered in feathers, waddling slowly through the forest, slicing down tree branches with scythe claws, and cropping leaves with a dainty beak. It's so strange it almost doesn't compute. But here's the deeper story. Is a symbol of evolutionary creativity that it shows us that dinosaurs weren't locked into neat boxes. Predator, prey, carnivore, herbivore. Evolution doesn't care about our categories. It builds what works, even if what works looks ridiculous. Likely evolved from small meat-eating ancestors. Over time, they began eating plants, developing longer necks, broader hips, and heavier bodies. Their hands, once tools for catching prey, became specialized for manipulating vegetation. Their claws, instead of shrinking, grew into enormous multi-purpose tools, a sort of prehistoric Swiss Army knife. And just because it wasn't a predator doesn't mean it wasn't dangerous. Those claws could still inflict devastating injuries if threatened. Like a modern gorilla, usually gentle, but with terrifying strength if provoked. A charging, swinging those claws in defense would be a terrifying sight. So why don't we see more of them in documentaries or movies? Because they don't fit the mold. They don't roar like T-Rex. They don't sprint like Velociraptor. They don't graze peacefully like Triceratops. They challenge our image of what a dinosaur should be. They're slow, strange, shaggy, and hard to categorize. And yet, they were real, successful, spread across Asia and North America. And part of a broader movement in the Cretaceous, where more and more dinosaurs were evolving unusual diets, feathers, and body shapes. There's something deeply human about this creature that it reminds us not to judge by appearances, not to assume sharp claws mean violence, that something which looks terrifying may actually just want to be left alone to eat in peace. It also forces us to expand our imagination, to look beyond the Jurassic Park archetypes, to embrace the full weirdness of evolution. Because life, especially 70 million years ago, wasn't trying to make sense to us. It was just trying to survive. Did that by becoming one of the strangest, most uniquely adapted dinosaurs ever. It didn't just survive. It thrived by breaking the rules. So if you ever find yourself wondering what evolution is capable of, if you ever think you've seen it all, remember the Freddy Krueger of the dinosaur world, the one with murder tools and a salad diet. The one that looked like a monster, but lived like a giant. Feathered Gardener. Chapter 8. Hadrosaurs. The singing dinosaurs. You've probably seen them 100 times without giving them a second thought. Herds of duck-billed dinosaurs roaming ancient floodplains. Grazers. Background extras in the Cretaceous drama. They're usually running from something, a predator, a fire, a volcanic blast. Just prey. Just the scenery. But what if I told you those so-called duckbills may have been some of the most complex, social, and vocal animals of their time? What if these dinosaurs didn't roar, but sang? Enter the hadrosaurs, a group of herbivorous dinosaurs that were far more than just walking buffets for the big meat-eaters. They were innovators, survivors, and quite possibly communicators, using sound in ways we're only beginning to understand. Let's start with their most iconic feature, the duck-bill. At first glance, it looks a little silly, wide, flat, and more like a gardening tool than a mouth. But don't be fooled. That bill, combined with a highly specialized dental structure, made hadrosaurs some of the most efficient plant eaters in dinosaur history. Inside their jaws were hundreds of tiny, tightly packed teeth, arranged in batteries, kind of like a conveyor belt. These teeth constantly replaced themselves and worked together to grind and shred vegetation with astonishing precision. Imagine a self-sharpening food processor that never stops working. That's a hadrosaur's mouth, but their diet isn't what made them famous. It's the crests. Some hadrosaurs, especially the evolved strange, hollow, bony crests that extended from their skulls like helmets, tubes, or even saxophone-shaped. Trumpets. Think of dinosaurs like Corythosaurus, Lambeosaurus, or the hauntingly elegant Parasaurolophus. That last one had a crest that could reach over 5 feet long, curving back like a windswept horn. For decades, no one knew what they were for. Were they weapons? Decorative ornaments? Air cooling systems? And then came the acoustic theory. And everything changed. Scientists began to realize that those hollow crests weren't just empty decoration. They were resonating chambers, tubes that connected to the nasal passages, potentially capable of producing deep, low-frequency sounds. Picture a trombone built into your skull. That's essentially what had. Using CT scans and 3D models, researchers began to reconstruct these crests. They digitally blew air through them. The results were stunning. Despite its heavy body and defensive adaptations, Ankylosaurus may not have been as slow as we think. Its limbs were sturdy, but not lumbering. Its wide stance gave it balance, especially when swinging that tail. Some paleontologists believe it could pivot quickly, or even make short bursts of movement when needed, not to flee, but to counterstrike. Think of it less like a tank and more like a living mace with eyes. And yet, even that comparison undersells the evolutionary elegance of this creature, because Ankylosaurus wasn't alone in its lineage. It belonged to a larger group, the Ankylosaurids, and throughout this family tree, we see a progression. Earlier species had smaller clubs. Others had spikes along the sides. Some had different armor patterns. Nature was testing designs, and Ankylosaurus, at the very end of the line, represents the pinnacle of that design, the final form, refined through millions of years of survival. In a way, it's a paradox, heavily armored, yet agile enough to react, a passive grazer, yet armed like a tank. Low to the ground, yet aware of its surroundings. It was built for balance, not brute strength. Its life was a constant equation of move enough, but not too much. Defend, but don't provoke. Stand your ground, but only when necessary. And here's something else. The tail club might not have been used all the time. Think of it more like a last resort, a final deterrent. Because most predators, especially smart ones like T-Rex, didn't want a fight that could get them injured. The mere presence of that club could have been enough. Evolution doesn't reward drama. It rewards results. And Ankylosaurus got results. In fact, the more we uncover about it, the more it seems like a quiet guardian of its time. Not flashy, not fast, but utterly effective. A dinosaur that didn't need to chase or roar or dominate the spotlight. It just needed to be. And that was enough. So the next time you see a model of Ankylosaurus, don't just admire the armor. Look closer. Imagine the twitch of its tail, the flick of its nose as it sniffs the wind, the low grunt as it brushes past trees, indifferent to the chaos around it. This was no mindless tank. This was an engineered survivor, a specialist, and one of the most perfectly defended animals to ever exist. And it didn't just survive the Cretaceous. It thrived in it. Chapter 15. Pachycephalosaurs didn't bash heads the way you think you. They've seen it 100 times in documentaries, cartoons, and museum films. Two dome-headed dinosaurs, built like linebackers, stare each other down. They huff, they charge, and boom, skull meets skull in a thunderous clash. Bone splinters, dust flies. Another round of prehistoric sumo wrestling has begun. That's Pachycephalosaurus, right? The head-butting dinosaur. Nature's living battering ram. Well, not so fast, because once again, the truth is stranger and smarter than the Hollywood myth. Let's rewind the tape and take a closer look at the real Pachycephalosaurs, and why everything we thought we knew about their behavior might just be a beautiful misunderstanding. Dome of mystery, first discovered in the early 20th century. Pachycephalosaurus and its relatives quickly gained fame for one reason: that incredibly thick skull. Some specimens show domes over 10 inches thick, made of solid bone. To early paleontologists, the function seemed obvious: headbutting. Why else evolve a bowling ball for a head? But it turns out, the reality is far more nuanced. For decades, the dominant theory was that these dinosaurs, especially Brachiosaurus wyomingensis, used their dome-shaped skulls to charge each other in contests of strength, like rams or bison. That story made it into textbooks, TV specials, even toys, and for good reason. It's a great story, but good stories aren't always true. When scientists began studying these skulls in more detail, especially with modern technology like CT scanning and 3D modeling, cracks began to form in the idea. Metaphorically and quite literally, because here's the problem. The dome might look tough, but what's underneath tells a different tale. The cracks beneath the surface. Let's break this down biomechanically. If two Brachiosaurus were ramming each other head-on at full speed, their necks would need to be perfectly structured to absorb and distribute that force. Think of the shock-absorbing spines in bighorn sheep. They're specially adapted to prevent brain injury, but in Brachiosaurus, the neck vertebrae don't show those adaptations. Worse still, the base of the skull is relatively narrow and fragile. The domes themselves are solid, yes, but that's like having a concrete helmet sitting on a stack of Jenga blocks. The impact would transfer downward and do damage. Some scientists even ran computer simulations. The results? Full-speed head-on collisions would likely result in severe neck injuries, possibly even death. Not the smartest mating strategy. And then there's the wear pattern. If headbutting was common, we'd expect consistent trauma or healed fractures across multiple skulls. But that's not what we find. Only a fraction, maybe 20%, of Brachiosaurus skulls show any kind of cranial lesions or bone remodeling that might suggest combat. And even those injuries aren't necessarily from headbutting. They could be from falls, predation, or interspecies scuffles. So, what's the dome for? The new theory's one possibility is display. Think of it like a peacock's tail or a moose's antlers. Not for actual fighting, but for signaling strength. A tall, well-formed dome might tell potential rivals or mates, I'm healthy, I'm mature, I'm dominant. And that might be all that was needed to win. Size doesn't always win in a fight. Confidence does. Other theories suggest that if there was any combat, it may have involved flank butting, hitting the sides of rivals rather than charging head-on. That would explain the tall, reinforced skull while avoiding the risk of breaking one's own neck. And there's the idea of ritualistic behavior, mock combat, gentle pushing, head pressing. Think giraffes or some antelope species today. Displays of strength without going full demolition derby. We also have to consider that not all dome-headed dinosaurs had full domes. Some, like Stegosaurus, had flatter skulls or partial domes, with elaborate ornamental ridges and bumps. These features likely evolved not for smashing, but for species recognition or sexual selection. Because in a world without vocal cords or bright colors, which don't fossilize, bone becomes the message. Shape, size, silhouette, these things mattered. And that leads to another revelation. Brachiosaurus were more diverse than we thought. They weren't just one dome-headed dinosaur. They were a whole group with varying skull shapes, body sizes, and likely behaviors. From the flat-headed Homalocephale of Mongolia to the bumpy Dracorex hogwartsia. Yes, that's its real name. This was a group experimenting with design. Some researchers even argue that several of these species, like Dracorex and Stygimoloch, might not be separate species at all, but rather juvenile forms of Brachiosaurus, with the domes growing larger and smoother as they aged. In other words, we might be mistaking teenagers for entire species and misreading the signals entirely. The rest of the dinosaur web. Obsessed over the head, but what about the rest of the animal? Brachiosaurus were bipedal, walking on two legs with long tails for balance. They had relatively short arms and small hands, suggesting they weren't using their forelimbs. For much beyond balance or minor manipulation, they were herbivores, possibly omnivorous, with simple leaf-shaped teeth. Their diet likely consisted of low-growing vegetation, fruits, or seeds, depending on the species and habitat. And despite their sturdy look, they were small to mid-sized dinosaurs, most under 15 feet long and weighing less than a small car. Not titans, not bulldozers, but smart? Possibly. Their brain size, particularly in the olfactory and visual regions, suggests decent eyesight and maybe even complex behaviors. Add that to the possibility of social signaling and selective displays, and you have a dinosaur that's not just a skull on legs. It's a communicator. A participant in a more subtle social dance. Why the myth endures, so why has the headbutting idea stuck for so long? Because it's dramatic. It's visual. It's simple. Two dinosaurs clash, one wins. Cue the dust in the victory pose. But nature doesn't always work like that. Sometimes the best adaptations aren't about combat. They're about avoiding it. About impressing, displaying, navigating social dynamics in ways we're only beginning to understand. And when we let go of the Hollywood version, when we stop picturing Brachiosaurus as a walking wrecking ball, we start to see something more interesting. Not a brute, but a signaler, not a fighter, but a negotiator. A creature with a story told not through violence, but through design. That's what makes paleontology so incredible. With every new skull, every CT scan, every closer look, the dinosaurs become more real, more complex, more alive. And sometimes, that means letting go of the myths we grew up with. Because as it turns out, the dome-headed dinosaur wasn't smashing skulls in prehistoric arenas. It was doing something far more sophisticated. It was speaking, in the only language it knew. Chapter 16. The misleading myth of the lizard-hipped dinosaurs. For over 130 years, every dinosaur you've ever heard of, from the towering T-Rex to the horned Triceratops, from Velociraptor to Stegosaurus, was categorized based on one body part, their hips. In the late 1800s, British paleontologist Harry Seeley proposed something revolutionary. Dinosaurs should be split into two groups based on the structure of their pelvic bones. He named one group Sauriskia, meaning lizard-hipped, because their hips resembled those of modern reptiles. The other group was Ornithischia, meaning bird-hipped, because their hips pointed backward. Like modern birds. It seemed neat, logical, clean. And for over a century, this division shaped how we thought about everything from dinosaur evolution to their behavior and even their fate. But here's the twist. That system? It may be completely wrong. And the real story about how dinosaurs are related, how birds evolved, and what it really means to be lizard-hipped or bird-hipped is far stranger and far more exciting. Let's break it down. 2. Hips, one giant misunderstanding first. What does lizard-hipped actually mean? In saurischians, which include theropods like T-Rex and long-necked sauropods, like Brachiosaurus, the pubis bone points forward. Like in modern reptiles. In ornithischians, which include armored dinosaurs, duckbills, horned dinosaurs, and pachycephalosaurs, the pubis bone points backward, running parallel with the ischium, similar to what we see in modern birds. So logically, birds must have evolved from bird-hipped dinosaurs, right? Wrong? The irony? Birds evolved from theropods, which are lizard-hipped. That's right. Birds came from the lizard-hipped side of the family tree, not the bird-hipped side. Let that sink in. The naming convention, taken at face value, is misleading. A fluke of Victorian taxonomy that's caused generations of confusion. But this isn't just a naming issue. It's a structural misunderstanding about how dinosaurs evolved. And it's now being challenged by new fossil evidence and cutting-edge evolutionary analysis. The Great Reclassification in 2017. A bombshell study dropped. Led by Matthew Barron and colleagues. The paper proposed a complete overhaul of dinosaur classification. They suggested that theropods, traditionally lizard-hipped, were actually more closely related to ornithischians, the so-called bird-hipped dinosaurs. This new clade was named Ornithocoelida, meaning bird-limbed, reflecting a shared set of traits, not just in the hips, but in skull features, limb structures, and more. If true, it would completely flatten the traditional dinosaur family tree, uniting raptors, T-Rex, and armored herbivores like Ankylosaurus under one evolutionary umbrella, while pushing long-necked sauropods like Diplodocus into a separate lineage. Altogether, it's as if you found out giraffes were more closely related to walruses than to zebras. That level of shake-up. The scientific community divided. Some hailed the study as groundbreaking. Others argued the data wasn't strong enough to overturn 130 years of classification. Since then, the debate has continued with papers, counterpapers, and revised phylogenies, bouncing back and forth like a scientific tennis match. But one thing's clear: dinosaur evolution is not as simple as two hips and a name. It never was. Beyond the bone. So, what's the bigger story here? It's not just about whether a bone points forward or backward. It's about how we use a single anatomical feature to define millions of years of evolutionary history. And how fragile that method can be when new evidence comes to light. The hip myth has blinded us to more subtle truths. Because as it turns out, hip orientation evolved multiple times. Backward-pointing pubis bones show up in very different lineages, not because of shared ancestry, but because of convergent evolution. Birds and ornithischians may both have backward hips, but that similarity likely evolved independently. Form follows function. And in both groups, the backward pubis may have made room for larger digestive systems, crucial for plant eaters, and possibly for birds with high metabolisms. So the bird-hipped name? Just a coincidence. And the lizard-hipped name? Equally arbitrary. In the grand sweep of time, bones shift. Evolution experiments. Names stick, even when they shouldn't, which is why paleontology is always rewriting itself. Birds in the bones. What does this mean for the story of birds? Well, regardless of which classification wins, the classic Sauruschia ornithischia split or the newer Ornithocoelida, one truth remains solid. Birds evolved from theropod. More specifically, from small feathered theropods within the group called Maniraptorans, the same group that includes Velociraptor and Deinonychus. These were agile, intelligent predators that began to show signs of flight-related adaptations: hollow bones, furcula wishbones, feathers, and eventually wings. And as they evolved, their pubis bone rotated backward, mimicking the ornithischian configuration, but through an entirely separate evolutionary path. It's one of the most fascinating cases of convergence in the animal kingdom. But for years, the misleading labels, bird-hipped, lizard-hipped, obscured that truth. They pointed us in the wrong direction. And in science, sometimes a bad name is all it takes to delay understanding what it all means. So why does this matter? Because the way we classify life isn't just about organizing fossils. It shapes how we tell stories about evolution, about extinction, about survival. And if those categories are flawed, so are the stories. The hip myth is a reminder that science isn't about being right, it's about getting closer to the truth. Even if that means tearing down what you thought you knew. It's a reminder that names aren't facts, that nature doesn't care what we call things, that sometimes a dinosaur can be called bird-hipped and have nothing to do with birds. And that's okay, as long as we're willing to adapt. Because in the end, every fossil is a fragment of a much bigger picture. And that picture? It's still coming into focus. So the next time you hear someone say, dinosaurs were split into lizard-hipped and bird-hipped, you can smile and know the real story is deeper, messier, and far more thrilling, just like the dinosaurs. Themselves, Chapter 17. Baby dinosaurs didn't look like their parents there. Something irresistible about the idea of a baby dinosaur. We picture a tiny T-Rex, wobbling on oversized legs, already wearing its signature scowl. Or a miniature Triceratops, fully horned and armored, trotting after its mother. Just smaller versions of the towering adults, scaled down, adorable, instantly familiar. But that image? It's a fantasy, because the truth is, baby dinosaurs often looked so drastically different from their adult forms that, for decades, scientists didn't even recognize them as the same species. They weren't just smaller, they were transforming. And that process called ontogeny, the changes an animal undergoes as it grows, reveals a hidden, often overlooked side of the dinosaur story. A tale of shape-shifting, adaptive evolution, and the ultimate survival strategy. Let's start with the most surprising example, the case of Dracorops and Stegosaurus. For years, paleontologists believed there were several species of dome-headed dinosaurs roaming the late Cretaceous of North America. Dracorops hogwartsia, with its spiky head and flat skull, Stegosaurus, with its high dome and hornlets, and Brachiosaurus, the classic dome-headed juggernaut. But in the early 2010s, researchers began to question the differences. Why were all the spiky-headed dinosaurs smaller? Why did the skull shapes change so drastically? The answer was revolutionary. They weren't separate species. They were the same dinosaur, at different stages of growth. Using CT scans and bone histology, scientists showed that Dracorops and Stegosaurus were likely juvenile and subadult forms of Brachiosaurus. Their skulls weren't fixed. They reshaped themselves as the animal aged, flattening, thickening, and even absorbing some of the outer spikes. It was like watching a dragon become a dome. Imagine mistaking a human toddler, a lanky teenager, and an adult bodybuilder for different species. That's what was happening. And it wasn't just the head. Entire body proportions changed. Shapeshifters. In disguise in many species, juvenile dinosaurs had large eyes, shorter snouts, and longer limbs in proportion to their bodies' features. That made them look completely unlike adults. They often lacked the ornamentation we associate with their mature forms. The horns, crests, frills, and sails were often absent or tiny in juveniles. A baby Triceratops? It didn't have 3 giant horns or a wide frill. It had a small bump for a nose horn and a short rounded frill. Nothing like the charging bull we know from popular media. Baby Ankylosaurs? No tail club. Young Parasaurolophus? Its famous head crest, that elegant, backward sweeping tube, was barely there, developing slowly over time. Why does this matter? Because it tells us that dinosaurs didn't just grow bigger. They grew differently. And that's a game changer. The ecological strategy in the modern world. Most animals don't change their shape drastically between infancy and adulthood. A baby elephant is a small elephant. A baby crocodile is just a miniature version of the adult. But dinosaurs? They took a different route. Many species appear to have occupied different ecological niches at different life stages. That means a juvenile might eat different food, move in different habitats, or avoid different predators than an adult of the same species. This kind of ontogenetic niche partitioning is rare and brilliant. It reduces competition between generations. Adults and juveniles don't fight over the same food or live in the same exact spaces. In a world teeming with dinosaur diversity, this would have been a massive evolutionary advantage. It's part of what allowed some species, like hadrosaurs and ceratopsians, to dominate the Cretaceous. And there's another twist. These growth changes may have also affected how herds functioned. Families and flocks. Fossil evidence from nesting sites, like those found in Montana's Egg Mountain and Mongolia's famous oviraptor nests, show that some dinosaurs nested in large colonies. Many laid eggs in organized circular clutches. Some adults even appear to have cared for their young, guarding the nests or brooding them like birds. But what's truly remarkable is what happens after hatching in several fossil beds. Scientists have found clusters of juvenile dinosaurs, likely from the same brood, preserved together. These weren't with adults. They were moving in crushes, groups of young, traveling together, learning the world. It's exactly what you see in some modern birds, like geese or ostriches, where juveniles group up for safety and exploration, while adults monitor from a distance. And over time, as these young dinosaurs grew, they gradually took on the features of adults, but not all at once. It was a metamorphosis, a slow reveal of horns, crests, armor, and tail weapons, like evolution playing a symphony in stages. This gradual development also means that many dinosaurs we once thought were rare, separate species, especially the strange little ones, might just be the kids. Why it took us so long to see, it might sound obvious now, but for decades, scientists were fooled. Why? Because fossilization is random. We often find isolated bones, partial skeletons, or fragmentary skulls, rarely an entire life cycle. Add to that the fact that dinosaur growth was not always linear. Some species grew fast and changed quickly, while others took years to develop their adult features. Without full skeletons and modern imaging tools, it was nearly impossible to piece together the life journey of a single animal. But as more juvenile specimens are found, and as technology like CT scanning, histology, bone slice analysis, and 3D modeling become standard, we're finally seeing the whole picture, and that picture is one of transformation. From round-headed hatchlings to horned adults, from fluff-covered chicks to sleek killers, from fragile nestlings to armored titans. Dinosaurs weren't just fascinating because of their size or strength. They were masters of change, the feathery twist, and yes, many of these baby dinosaurs hatched with feathers. In species like Truden, Sinosauropteryx, and Uteranus, fossilized juveniles are covered in fine downy fuzz. Not full flight feathers, but something like chick fluff. It likely kept them warm. But there's more. Some may have shed or replaced these proto-feathers as they grew, developing more structured plumage, or even losing feathers entirely if they became too large to need insulation. In this way, dinosaurs mirrored birds, but they weren't identical. Each species had its own strategy, its own path from egg to adult. And that's what makes it all so exciting. Because when you look at a baby dinosaur, you're not just seeing a miniature adult, you're seeing a future in motion. An animal caught mid-transformation, a living snapshot of evolutionary design in progress. Chapter 18. The sauropods that had armor and spikes. They were the skyscrapers of the dinosaur world. Sauropods. Towering, long-necked titans, the biggest land animals Earth has ever known. Creatures like Brachiosaurus, Apatosaurus, Diplodocus, and Argentinosaurus dominated the Jurassic and Cretaceous landscapes, grazing treetops with quiet majesty. And for decades, we thought they relied on one thing for protection: size. After all, who would mess with a 40-ton mountain of muscle? But nature doesn't put all its eggs in one basket. And as it turns out, some sauropods evolved something extra: armor, spikes, and clubs. Yes, even the giants had their secrets. And it all starts with one strange, spiky enigma: Saltosaurus, the armored titan discovered in Argentina in the 1980s. Saltosaurus was unlike any sauropod paleontologists had ever seen. It was relatively small for a sauropod, about 12 meters long and weighing around 7 tons. But what stunned researchers wasn't its size. It was what was under its skin. Fossilized remains showed clear evidence of osteoderms, small bony plates embedded in the skin, like natural body armor. That was unheard of for sauropods. These weren't ornamental bones. They were defense, like a built-in shield wall. Some of these osteoderms were flat, others were more nodular, even spiked. The pattern suggests that Saltosaurus wasn't just armored along the back, but possibly along its sides and neck, vulnerable. Areas for predator attacks. Suddenly, the old image of sauropods as unprotected giants didn't hold up. Nature had equipped at least some of them with tactical defense. And Saltosaurus wasn't an isolated case. The ankylosaur connection? At first glance, these osteoderms looked suspiciously similar to those found in ankylosaurs, the tank-like dinosaurs famous for their clubbed tails and full body plating. But here's the kicker. Sauropods and ankylosaurs aren't even closely related. This wasn't shared ancestry. It was convergent evolution. Two completely different dinosaur lineages independently developing body armor for survival. It shows just how deadly the late Cretaceous was, even for giants. And Saltosaurus wasn't alone. More than Saltosaurus over the years, other armored sauropods have surfaced, especially in South America and Africa. Together, they belong to a group called the Titanosaurs, a diverse branch of sauropods that emerged in the Cretaceous and took over many of the niches once held by their Jurassic cousins. Some titanosaurs, like Brachiosaurus, showed evidence of small dermal ossifications, early signs of armor. Others, like Nuquinsaurus, may have carried more elaborate osteoderm systems. And then there's Ampulosaurus from Europe, which may have had spiky plates along its back and shoulders. But perhaps the most jaw-dropping revelation came from a discovery in Madagascar. A fossilized titanosaur named Rapotosaurus crasei, unearthed in the early 2000s, had scutes that hinted at partial armor and raised a question. How widespread was this trait? Was armor the exception or the rule? Some paleontologists now believe that many titanosaurs had some degree of dermal armor, especially the smaller and more compact ones. It may not have covered the whole body, but even a few rows of bony knobs could deter attacks from the large predators of the time, like Majungasaurus or Mopasaurus, and in some species, the armor wasn't just passive protection. It was a weapon. Meet Shingopanna and the Kluban 2021. Researchers re-examined the fossils of Shingopanna songwensis, a mid-sized titanosaur from what's now Tanzania. While the osteoderms themselves weren't dramatic, the shape and placement suggested something new. A few years earlier, another titanosaur fossil had revealed a massive, hollowed osteoderm, almost like a bony capsule. Some suggested it might have supported a spike, horn, or even a form of tail club. A tail club on a sauropod? It sounds impossible. But if true, it would make certain titanosaurs the largest club-wielding animals in history. And it makes evolutionary sense. As predators grew more specialized, so did prey. Saltosaurus and its armored cousins may have faced down the likes of Abelisaurus, Carnotaurus, and even early tyrannosaurids. Against such opponents, armor wasn't just useful, it was vital. And for those sauropods too small to rely on size alone, a well-placed tail swipe or a row of spikes could be the difference between survival and extinction. Why we got it wrong for so long. The reason we never associated sauropods with armor for so long is because most early sauropod discoveries came from North America and Europe, places dominated by larger, unarmored giants like Diplodocus, Brontosaurus, and Comatosaurus. These animals didn't seem to have armor. Their sheer size may have been enough to discourage predators, but titanosaurs, the Cretaceous successors to those Jurassic giants, evolved in isolation. Across South America, Africa, and parts of Asia, in these regions they had to adapt to new threats, new environments, and new survival strategies. It's another reminder that evolution is regional. It doesn't play by global rules. The sauropods we thought we knew were just one piece of a much bigger, spikier puzzle, a new image of the giants. So what does this mean for how we imagine sauropods? No longer should we see them as sluggish, passive plant eaters wandering open plains with nothing but size to protect them. Instead, picture this: a herd of Saltosaurus, shoulder to shoulder, their backs bristling with armored plates. The juveniles huddle near the center, On the perimeter, adults swing heavy tails, scanning the horizon. In the distance, a Carnotaurus watches, but doesn't approach, because it knows these giants aren't soft targets. They're moving fortresses. Nature didn't just build them tall. It built them tough. And in doing so, it gave us a whole new dimension to the dinosaur story, one where even the biggest beasts weren't invincible. But they were ready. Chapter 19. The carnivores that looked like herbivores. They say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. Turns out, you shouldn't judge a dinosaur by its face either, because not all predators look the part. Some of them, despite their deadly diets, were disguises nature never meant to conceal, but which fooled us anyway for over a century. They had beaks. Feathers. Long claws, bulging bellies, and in some cases, no visible teeth. These were the carnivores that looked like herbivores, and in many ways, they tell us more about dinosaur evolution than the sharp-toothed monsters we're used to. Let's begin with a creature so strange, scientists gave it a name that means monstrous claw. Therizinosaurus, the clawed enigma. Imagine a dinosaur nearly the size of a Tyrannosaurus, covered in feathers with a pot belly and a neck like a giraffe's. Its hands are tipped with 3-meter-long scythe-like claws. It walks on 2 legs, slowly swaying as it moves. You'd be forgiven for thinking this animal was some kind of prehistoric sloth, but this was Therizinosaurus, and for a long time, we didn't know what it ate. At first glance, it screams herbivore. The body suggests bulk digesting plants. The long neck hints at high browsing. The skull? Small, lightly built, with a beak instead of prominent teeth. And yet, Therizinosaurus belongs to the theropods, the same group that includes Velociraptor, Allosaurus, and T-Rex. It's a relative of some of the fiercest carnivores in history. So how does that make sense? Because Therizinosaurus is part of a group called Therizinosaurs, bizarre theropods that shifted from a meat-based diet to a herbivorous or omnivorous lifestyle, all while retaining some very unherbivore-like traits. The claws? Possibly for defense or even for pulling down vegetation. The body? Suited for fermenting tough plant matter. The lineage? Pure predator stock. This was a carnivore that evolved away from meat, but never shed its predator's frame, and it wasn't alone. Oviraptorosaurs. Beaked, feathered, and misunderstood meat. Oviraptor, the egg thief. When it was first discovered in the 1920s, fossilized atop a clutch of eggs, it was accused of stealing them. It had a parrot-like beak, no visible teeth, and was placed firmly on the villain side of the prehistoric narrative. But later, discoveries revealed something astonishing. Oviraptor wasn't stealing those eggs. It was brooding them, like a bird. And those powerful beaks? Likely used to crush hard food, seeds, nuts, mollusks, maybe even eggs of its own prey. It turns out, many Oviraptorosaurs were omnivores. Some may have specialized in particular diets, plants, insects, shellfish, but they all belong to the theropod line. They walked like raptors. They hunted like raptors. They just didn't look like raptors. Fossils of related species, like Caudipteryx and Anzu, show full feather coats, stubby wings, and deep bellies, built more like ostriches than lizards. But their internal anatomy and genetic lineage point right back to carnivorous ancestry. These were predators camouflaged as weird birds. Ornithomimids. The ostrich mimics. Let's go even further down the path of confusion. Ornithomimus, Struthiomimus, and their relatives, the so-called ostrich mimic. Dinosaurs were among the fastest land animals of their time. Long legs, long necks, beaked faces, sleek feathered bodies. They looked almost exactly like modern ostriches, but again, these dinosaurs were theropods, members of the meat-eating branch of the dinosaur family tree, and yet, no teeth. Instead they had beaks. Some had gizzards with stones inside. Used to grind up vegetation. So what were they eating? Probably everything. Plants, insects, lizards, eggs, fruits, whatever they could catch or scavenge. They were the opportunists of the late Cretaceous. And if you stumbled across one today, you wouldn't guess its killer lineage. You'd probably just say, "Hey, that looks like a weird prehistoric bird." You wouldn't be wrong, but you'd be missing the twist, because these weren't just bird lookalikes. They were descendants of predators, using speed and beaks to survive in a rapidly changing world. Why carnivores changed their look? The question is, why? Why would meat-eating dinosaurs begin to look like plant eaters? The answer lies in adaptation. As ecosystems evolved, and as plants diversified during the Cretaceous explosion of flowering flora, some carnivorous dinosaurs found opportunities in new food sources: seeds, fruit, tough vegetation, insects. The rigid, pointed teeth of classic predators weren't well suited for this. So over millions of years, some lineages began to lose their teeth. Others developed keratinous beaks. Their digestive systems shifted. Their bodies changed. They became slower, bulkier, more suited to foraging than chasing. But they never left their roots behind. These weren't herbivores in the traditional sense. They were predators, reinventing themselves. And they revealed just how plastic evolution can be. The takeaway: never trust the look. So, what do we learn from these deceptive dinosaurs? That evolution isn't linear, that predators don't always stay predators, that a beak doesn't mean peace, and claws don't always mean killing, and most importantly, that dinosaurs, like animals today, were diverse, adaptive, and full of surprises. In the end, some of the most dangerous ancestors of birds didn't need to roar, or bare teeth, or look terrifying. They just needed to be clever. And they proved that. Survival isn't about looking like a predator. It's about being ready for whatever nature throws your way. Chapter 20. The Final Dinosaur. It looked nothing like the rest. Approx. 2,000 words. Somewhere outside, a songbird lands on a branch. Its feathers shimmer in the sun. It tilts its head, pecks the bark, and flutters off in a flurry of delicate wings and high-pitched chirps. It's an ordinary moment. Unless you know what you're looking at. Because that bird, that everyday harmless creature, is a dinosaur. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. Literally. At single quotes. As the final chapter in a story that began over 230 million years ago. The last branch on a family tree filled with giants, armored beasts, scythe-clawed nightmares, and tyrant kings. The only member to survive. The greatest extinction event in Earth's history. The one that didn't just endure, but evolved. Let's talk about the true last dinosaur, and why it looked nothing like the rest. A survivor in disguise when the asteroid struck Earth 66 million years ago. It ended the reign of non-avian dinosaurs. Fires raged, oceans boiled, dust blotted out the sun. In a matter of years, 75% of all life vanished. Gone were the horned ceratopsians, the duck-billed Hadro, Osaurus, the towering Sauropods, and yes, the mighty T-Rex. But not everything died. Because tucked away in the underbrush, hidden in forests and wetlands, were tiny, feathered dinosaurs. Some could glide. Others could fly. Many nested in trees, laid eggs, and cared for their young. They were the aviolans, the dinosaur group that included early birds. And against all odds, they made it through. Somehow they survived the dark, and when the skies cleared, they exploded. Across the planet. From raptor to robinson, what did that final dinosaur look like? Imagine something the size of a pigeon, with clawed wings, feathers all over its body, and sharp eyesight. It may have had teeth, a long bony tail, and 3 fingers. On each wing. It didn't look like a Velociraptor or a Triceratops. But genetically, it was closer to them than to any modern animal. This little survivor likely resembled Ethionis, a bird-like dinosaur from the late Cretaceous that still had teeth, a beak, and powerful flight. Over millions of years, as ecosystems stabilized, this creature's descendants began to change. Teeth vanished, tails shortened, skulls became rounded. Feathers diversified, and the modern bird, from hummingbirds to ostriches, was born. Today, there are over 10,000 species of living birds. All of them are dinosaurs, not just descended from dinosaurs. Not just relatives, they are dinosaurs. Avian dinosaurs. To be exact. What makes a dinosaur a dinosaur? Here's the thing most people misunderstand. The word dinosaur doesn't mean giant lizard. It refers to a specific evolutionary lineage, animals with upright limbs beneath the body, a particular arrangement of hip bones, specific skull openings, and a shared ancestor. Birds meet every criterion. They are the direct descendants of theropods, specifically small feathered maniraptorans like Microraptor and Deinonychus. That's right. Your backyard sparrow is closer to T-Rex than to a crocodile. A hawk shares more with a Velociraptor than with any modern reptile. Even their eggs, their lungs, their hollow bones, all of it screams dinosaur. We've just learned to call them something else. Evolution in overdrive. What happened after that? Catastrophic impact. Wasn't just survival. It was a reinvention. With the big dinosaurs gone, birds filled their ecological roles, and then some. They became flyers, swimmers, divers, runners, singers, migrators. Some evolved to mimic insects. Others became apex predators. From the kiwi of New Zealand to the penguins of Antarctica, birds conquered every environment the non-avian dinosaurs never reached. They were no longer just dinosaurs. They were the future of dinosaurs. But they look so different. Here's where it gets tricky. Most people can't connect the bird outside their window to the dinosaur in a museum. And that's understandable. Birds look soft, light, fragile. Dinosaurs, as we've been shown in movies, are brutal, scaly, roaring beasts. But we now know much of that imagery is wrong. Dinosaurs weren't all lizard-like. Many were feathered. Many were small. Many were social. Some nested in colonies. Some communicated with sound. Some used visual displays, even dance, to attract mates. In other words, they were already a lot like birds. So birds didn't change that much. We just misunderstood the originals. The legacy that lives on this chapter isn't just about biology. It's about perception. Because the most extraordinary thing about the final dinosaur isn't that it survived. It's that we didn't recognize it for what it was. Even though it's all around us. The songs you hear at dawn, dinosaur calls, the flocks that move in perfect synchronicity, dinosaur behavior, the iridescent feathers, the nesting rituals, the migrations that span hemispheres, all of it to 100% dinosaur legacy. Even their eyes, packed with cones, tuned to ultraviolet light, are more complex than most mammals. These are creatures whose evolutionary past didn't fade. It evolved forward, the hidden giant. Here's the kicker. In sheer numbers, birds are now the most diverse and widespread form of dinosaur ever to exist. They've outlived every other group. They're smarter, faster, and more adaptable than their ancestors. And in a strange way, they're more successful than T-Rex ever was. Not by size. Not by fear. By transformation. By becoming something radically different, and yet staying the same at their core. The final dinosaur didn't need horns or armor. It needed feathers. It needed wings. It needed to outlast the end of the world and quietly take it over.